Chapter Chapter 39. The Northern Black Sea, the Case of the Bosporan Kingdom. Maya Murat. Introduction. Northern Black Sea Littoral, Figure 39.1, is often considered a political and cultural entity and is treated as such in scholarship. In fact, it is comprised of three rather distinct, both geographically and historically, areas: the region of Olbia and its environs in the northwestern Black Sea, Chersonese, its Kora, and the western Crimea, and finally the Bosporan Kingdom, located in the eastern Crimea and the Taman Peninsula, which is the focus of this chapter. These three areas differed in their political and cultural developments, in particular in their relationships with the local people and nomadic tribes that were a constant presence. In scholarship, the Olbian state is perhaps best known for the cult of Achilles Pontarchos, the master of Pontos, whose major temple was located on the nearby island of Luke, Hommel 1980, Ruzieva 2003, Hupe 2006. Although some evidence for Achilles' cult was also found in Chersonese, the latter is generally recognized as the cult center of Parthenos, a maiden goddess identified with Artemis and Iphigenia, and the main protectress of the city, Gulda 2009. This chapter explores certain religious traditions of the Bosporan Kingdom, Figure 39.1, from the foundation of the Apoikiai, new settlements, literally, home away from home, sometime in the first half of the 6th century through the mid-1st centuries BCE, that is, through the death of Mithridates VI. Although this region is gradually becoming recognized as an important, albeit distant, part of the Greek oikoumene, inhabited universe, it remains far from being well represented in scholarship. Following a brief historical overview of the area, this chapter will first address some of the cults practiced over the course of 5 centuries on the Temenos, the sacred area of the city, and the Acropolis of Panticapion, the capital of the Bosporan Kingdom. The section Bosporan topography, cult places, and religious beliefs will examine associations between the Chthonian sanctuaries and the unusual features of the local landscape, namely the mud volcanoes. In both cases, it will focus on the newly discovered archaeological data and will present some new interpretations of the older material. Image. Figure 39.1 Greek colonies in the northern Black Sea, c.450 BCE. Map adapted from MapMaster CC BY-SA 3.0. In the late 7th early 6th century BCE, when most of the Mediterranean had already been settled, the Greeks turned their attention to the Black Sea and founded numerous apoikiai on its shores, thus turning it, so to speak, into a Greek pond. We are concerned here with the northern shore. By the second quarter of the 6th century BCE, a number of Greek colonies, mostly Milesian, were founded on both sides of the Kerch Straits, known in antiquity as the Cimmerian Bosporos. Initially politically independent, these apoikiai were united into some sort of polity around 480 BCE, Diod. Sic 12.31. Thus the Bosporan Kingdom was created, with Panticapion, the main city of the European Bosporos, as its capital. Starting in the late 5th century BCE, the neighboring territories, with their non-Greek populations, were gradually added to this dominion. Eventually, the population of the kingdom comprised the Greeks from Ionia and from other cities around the Black and Mediterranean seas, and various indigenous tribes, known to us from literary and epigraphic sources. The Bosporan Kingdom was one of the early examples of a state with a mixed population of Greeks and barbarians, featuring, at least until the early centuries CE, a thoroughly Hellenized, but nevertheless complex, cultural milieu. Although the Bosporos remained ostensibly independent, it became a provincial satellite of Rome shortly after the death of Mithridates VI in 63 BCE. By 14 CE, Bosporan rulers adopted the dynastic names of Tiberii Iulii and began to style themselves friends of Caesar and of the Roman people, while apparently enjoying considerable independence in their domestic and foreign policy. Gjdukovic 1971, 359. The prosperity of the kingdom was ruined in the 230s-40s CE by an invasion of the Goths. The Huns, arriving in the 370s CE, delivered the final blow. Gjdukovic 1971, 355. Greeks and barbarians. The concept of cultural, and especially religious, syncretism between the Greeks and barbarians remains one of the most hotly debated, yet practically insoluble, problems of scholarship dedicated to the northern Black Sea. The idea that the Greek colonists came into close contact with the local population immediately after their arrival, and that strong mutual influences could be discerned as early as the late 6th century BCE, was common in Soviet scholarship and occasionally persists in recent Russian scholarship, Ustinova 1999, Schorb 2007. However, this viewpoint seems both too radical and too simplistic. First and foremost, we know surprisingly little about the ethnic situation on both shores of the Bosporus. The general consensus is that these lands were scarcely populated, and that the Greek apoikiai were established in unoccupied areas. Archaeological investigations have not so far uncovered any archaeological remains immediately predating Greek occupation. However, the names of the indigenous sedentary tribes living in the surrounding areas have come down to us from literary sources, such as Hecataios of Miletus, Herodotos, Strabo, Diodorus, and from the Bosporan inscriptions. Among these tribes, the Maiocians, traditionally placed along the eastern shore of the Azov Sea, ancient Maiotis, were, in all probability, not an ethnos but a group of tribes living there. At present, about 200 settlements have been identified within the territory associated with the Maiocians, Limberis and Mochenko 2010, 190. However, Maiocian material culture was rather unsophisticated, and we know virtually nothing about these people's religious beliefs. As for the other tribes mentioned, Tortoi, Dandarioi, Sesoi, their locations are completely unknown and they continue to remain archaeological phantoms. The closest neighbors of the Greeks on the Taman Peninsula were the Scythians. At this point, only one settlement, Semibratni or Labris, and its necropolis can be associated with them. Based on the poorly published results of limited excavations conducted in the 1950s, it seems that, by the second quarter of the 5th century, the Scythians were thoroughly Hellenized, Goronkarovsky and Ivanchik 2010, 224, 230. In the eastern Crimea, traces of pre-Greek occupation have not been uncovered thus far and no indigenous tribes were or are associated with these lands. However, these territories might have been controlled from a distance. Because of their proximity to the Eurasian steppe belt, this area was subject to periodic influxes of nomadic tribes of Indo-Iranian stock, commonly referred to as Scythians. It does seem that, from very early on and throughout their existence, the Greek apoikiai had to interact with these nomadic Scythians. As recent archaeological investigations of the Bosporan cities testify, these encounters were often anything but peaceful, Tolstikov and Murat 2013, 182-3. Obviously, Greek settlers were not living in isolation, and constantly interacted with various non-Greeks as initial economic and political connections were forged. In due course, quite a few of these non-Greeks settled nearby, or even in the apoikiai, as some of their territories were incorporated into the Bosporan kingdom. By approximately the early 4th century BCE, a new cultural identity, which might be called Bosporan, had developed. The Bosporan culture was Hellenic at its core, and Greek remained its lingua franca for both oral and written communications. Undoubtedly, Greek colonists had to adapt to the new surroundings, new climate, and their new neighbors. However, as the evidence demonstrates, what might be deemed to be barbarian influences on the religion and material culture of the Greek apoikiai of the Bosporos are not detectable at all, at least, not until the 1st century CE, a time period that falls beyond the scope of this chapter. The Temenos and Acropolis of Panticapion, 6th, 1st centuries BCE. Panticapion is the metropolis of the Bosporians and is situated at the mouth of Lake Maiotis. Panticapion is a hill inhabited on all sides in circuit of 20 stadia. To the east it has a harbour, and docks for about 30 ships, and it also has an acropolis. Strabo 7.4.4. Located in the centre of the modern city of Kerch, on a large hill known nowadays as Mount Mithridates, ancient Panticapion, which became the capital of the Bosporan kingdom, is believed to have already existed by the second quarter of the 6th century BCE. The main temenos of the city is traditionally thought to have been located on the upper plateau of Mount Mithridates overlooking the sea, as shown by the numerous, albeit fragmentary, finds dating from the 6th to early 5th centuries BCE. These include sculpture fragments, acroteria from large and small altars, bases and other fragments of votive columns from small structures of the Ionic order, along with architectural details from several monumental buildings of the Ionic order. Apollo. Apollo was considered one of the most important deities of the Greek pantheon in the North Pontic area, Ruzieva 2005, 204-6. It has been suggested that, during the Pontic colonization, Apollo Iatros, by far the most popular epiclesis of this deity, was elevated by the oracle of Didyma to a special status as the main protector of the colonists and of the newly founded settlements around the Black Sea. Earhart 1983, 130-2. For an overview of the literature see Ustinova 2009, 246-60, on the importance of the cult among the Milesian colonists, see Plin. HN 34.18, Strabo 7.6.1, Koshelenko 2010, 380. The hypothesis that an early temple dedicated to Apollo, most probably Apollo Iatros, once stood on the summit of Mount Mithridates was first proposed by V.D. Blavatsky in 1950. This was based on the finds of several column bases and an architrave, all of the Ionic order. Over the years, more fragments of capitals and of entablature have been discovered. A recent meticulous investigation of these fragments allowed V.P. Tolstikov to corroborate the assumption that a large temple-like structure of the Ionic order, Samian type, dating from 500 to 485 BCE, indeed stood on the Temenos of Panticapion, Tolstikov 2010. However, its attribution to Apollo Iatros remains a conjecture, albeit a plausible one. The rapid growth of the city was halted sometime in the period 490 to 480 BCE, probably because of attacks by nomadic tribes, attested by destruction and burned strata found in the Greek apoikei on both sides of the Cimmerian Bosporos. The recently discovered traces of some unusual ritual activity on the Temenos of Panticapion are perhaps related to these military events. In the middle of the Temenos, perhaps not far from the presumed location of the Temple of Apollo Iatros, on a makeshift platform right on top of the burned stratum that contained numerous arrowheads of Scythian type, was found a skeleton of a horse. The horse had been decapitated, cut in half, and its spine removed. Afterwards, the carcass was carefully placed on its side with all four legs, hooves still in place, neatly folded underneath. This mutilation was quite possibly the result of sphagion, a ritual killing, performed by the Bosporan Greeks after yet another military confrontation. The horse probably belonged to the presumed attackers, most likely the Scythians, as several elements of the harness, bronze roundels in the form of a coiled wolf in the Scythian animal style, were found on the skeleton. This so far unique discovery may be evidence for a ritual killing with some elements of sympathetic magic, in which an enemy horse was symbolically identified with, and substituted for, the human enemy, Scythians. The animal's death may have been meant to influence the outcome of future battles. What we do to this horse, may we do to our enemies, Tolstikov and Murat forthcoming. It is possible that the early temple of Apollo suffered during these military events and was later rebuilt. The cult of Apollo Iatros is well attested in Bosporan epigraphy from the late 5th century BCE onwards, CIRB 6, 10, 25, 974, 1037, 1044, Tolstikov 1992, 69, Figure 10, 13, 95n9, Koshelenko 2010, 381. A dedicatory inscription on the statue pedestal dating from 240 to 220 BCE is of particular importance. It shows that, by at least the 3rd century BCE, members of the ruling dynasty of Spartocidi were hereditary chief priests of Apollo Iatros, CIRB 25. Artemis Hecate Ditagoya. Within the Temenos, in the vicinity of the sacred area of Apollo, dwelled his sister Artemis. In the course of excavations, 2 chambers have been uncovered, their foundations cut into the natural rock and partially faced with marble veneer. The nature of the finds, such as the fragments of marble sculptures and an offering table, trapeza, with a dedicatory inscription, implies that this structure had religious functions, and it has been identified as part of a sanctuary. The archaeological material found in these two chambers dates from the 2nd century BCE through the early 1st century CE, Tolstikov 1987. The identity of the deity, or deities, worshipped there is not certain. Fragments of a large statue of a goddess of which a head, fingers, small pieces of drapery, and fragments of the feet with intricate sandals survive suggest Artemis. Furthermore, a marble Hecateion, a triple-bodied statue of Hecate encircled by 3 dancers, was also discovered there. Of particular interest is a marble trapeza, supported by 2 sculpted pilasters ending in lion's paws, which was most probably placed in a niche in the first room. A Greek dedicatory inscription placed on the front facet of the table presents a document of utmost importance for the political and religious history of the Bosporan Kingdom, Tolstikov 1987, 101, Figure 14, Vinogradov 1987. According to the inscription, the offering table was dedicated to the sanctuary by Princess Senomotis, daughter of King Scylla and wife of Heraclides. The dedication was made for the good health and well-being of the Bosporan king Perisides V, the last king of the Spartakidae dynasty, who, sometime in the last quarter of the 2nd century BCE, handed over his power to Mithridates VI, Vinogradov 1987, 59, Strabo 7.4.4. The recipient of the beautiful trapeza was a female deity named Ditagoya. This is the first, and thus far the only, instance when this evidently non-Greek name appears in written documents. Its linguistic origins remain obscure. Senomotis' father Scylla, rumored to have fathered numerous children, Strabo 7.4.3, was a well-known king of the late Scythians whose capital was located in Scythian Neapolis, on the outskirts of the modern-day city of Simferopol, Zaitsev 2001. This inscription, written sometime between 130 to 120 BCE, throws some light not only on Greco-Scythian political relationships in the Bosporos, but also on the religious interactions in the kingdom. It vividly demonstrates that dynastic marriages between Scythian royalty, daughter of the king, and Greek nobility, Heraclides, took place, and that a certain barbarian element was present not only in the Bosporan cities, but at court as well. Ditagoya, a deity of non-Greek origin, was openly worshipped by a Scythian princess in the capital of the Bosporan kingdom, in the sanctuary presumably dedicated to Artemis and Hecate, or perhaps to Artemis Hecate, Burkett 1985, 171 and 15. Indeed, there is further evidence that suggests that Ditagoya was somehow associated with Hecate, as a very similar Hecateion was found in the sacred area of a megaron, a palatial complex, excavated in Scythian Neapolis. Its most likely residents were King Scylla and his family members, Zaitsev 2001, 268-70. Worship of Hecate alone is attested at another location in Panticapion. A small cave on the outskirts of the city was discovered between 1846 and 1850. Its floor was covered with a relatively thick layer of pebbles and ash. On the wall opposite the entrance, in a marble-lined niche, stood a marble Hecateion dated to the early Hellenistic period. This small edifice was located on the border between the city and the necropolis, near the road and by one of the city gates, as befits Hecate's identity as an inhabitant of liminal spaces and crossroads, and a protector of city gates, Burkett 1985, 171, Olaric 2009, 83. Artemis seems to have enjoyed a long and continuous veneration on the Acropolis of Panticapion, next to her divine brother. The earliest recorded dedication to Artemis of Ephesos, an inscription on a bronze handle of an infundibulum, a ritual vessel of Etruscan origin, of the 6th century BCE, comes from this area, Trister 1999. More recently, the discovery of a marble lamp dating to the early 6th century BCE also supports the Artemis connection. These types of lamps are often associated with the sanctuaries of Artemis in Ephesos, Samos, and Broran, Tolstikov and Murat 2013, 183-5. These early finds all come from the area adjacent to the above-mentioned sanctuary of Artemis Hecate Ditagoya, which was still functioning in the second half of the 2nd century BCE. A dedication to Artemis, set up by King Pharnax, son of Mithridates VI and ruler of the Bosporos from 63 to 47 BCE, was also found in the vicinity of this sanctuary, CIRB 28. Palace Temple. A large monumental complex with an area of at least 1,350 square meters was recently excavated on the eastern plateau of Mount Mithridates, within the territory of the Acropolis of Panticapion. This edifice, which seems to have functioned from the mid-4th until at least the late 2nd century BCE, featured a peristyle court and was identified by the excavator as a royal residence, or basileia, Tolstikov 2003, 726-32. In its immediate vicinity, the remains of a small temple in Antes have been discovered. The completely preserved foundation of the temple featured an antiseismic device. 2 horizontal parallel grooves ran through the blocks of the foundation around the whole perimeter. These most probably contained wooden beams soaked in resin to protect the foundation from earthquakes. Tolstikov 2003, 730, Lozovoy and Dobrovolskaya 2010, 135-6. The temple's unusual proximity to the royal residence suggests that it was a palace church of sorts and perhaps was frequented by the inhabitants of the basileia. Built probably in the mid-3rd century BCE, the temple functioned through the first half of the 1st century BCE. The unusually good preservation of the temple's foundation is a result of a thick layer of green clay that was used to level the surface after the temple's destruction. Along with the foundation, a stratum of debris containing objects present in the temple at the time of destruction was preserved as well. Among the objects found in this layer were 112 fragments of terracotta figurines that comprised the majority of finds at the temple site. Among them, one particular deity, Dionysos, as well as his followers, was prominently represented. It is not surprising that Dionysos was one of the deities worshipped in the small temple on the Acropolis of Panticapion, at least during the last phase of the temple's existence. Temples and sanctuaries located in the vicinity of royal residences often housed the cults of the divine patrons of the rulers. Mithridates VI Eupator Dionysos, who became a new ruler of the Bosporan kingdom in the late 2nd century BCE, was well known as an avid devotee of Dionysos, his patron god. Homer 1884, 102-4, Plat. Sulla 11, Sic. Pro Flac. 25.60, and must have been responsible for increasing the popularity of this cult in the Bosporan capital. Ilyina and Muratova 2008, Saprakin 2009, 250-1. These 3 case studies provide an overview of, as well as wide-ranging evidence for, different types of cults, and reveal something of the ways in which gods were introduced and worshipped, and how some cults developed, in the capital of the Bosporan kingdom. The cult of Apollo Ietros, the patron of the first colonists, was brought by them from Asia Minor and remained the main state cult well into the late 3rd century BCE, at the very least. Artemis was venerated alongside her brother. It seems that, at some point, the cult of Artemis was combined with that of Hecate, another deity with Asia Minor connections. In the case of Ditagoya, a goddess of unknown origin, who, at least in the 2nd century BCE, was associated with Artemis Hecate, we might have a unique example of an assimilated foreign deity, who was venerated in the central Temenos of the capital. The small temple located next door to the royal residence on the Acropolis of Panticapion seems to have been a semi-private temple serving the basileia. Although the original resident deities remain unknown, one of its latest likely occupants, Dionysos, was the patron deity of the ruler at the time. The traces of a ritually slain enemy horse constitute a unique example of the war-related magic rites performed by the Bosporan Greeks. Bosporan topography, cult places, and religious beliefs. The focus now changes from the cults in the capital to the more general area of the Bosporan kingdom. This section deals with one of the most fundamental questions in the history of any religion: how does man know where to worship his gods? Morkin 1987, 135. Here, we consider some evidence for how colonists selected the right sacred spots for sanctuaries and temples near to their new settlements, Koshelenko 2010, 356. Topographical features of the landscape often played a crucial role in this selection. The Greeks looked for signs, usually conspicuous landmarks of some kind, that indicated the inherent sacredness of a locale. Although two shores of the Cimmerian Bosporus, the Asian and European sides, presented rather different natural environments in antiquity, as they still do today, there is one particular natural phenomenon commonly found on both sides of the straits: mud volcanoes, Lozovoy and Dobrovolskaya 2010, 136. Their numinous beauty and the surrounding landscapes are likely to have mesmerized the Greeks. Large bubbling puddles, irregular knobby cones of different sizes oozing dark viscous mud, often accompanied by steam, odorous vapors, and noises, all these features were probably understood as signs of proximity to the entrance to the Hades. Ivanchik 2010, 322-3. It is not surprising to find sanctuaries that most likely housed Chthonian cults located in their immediate vicinity, and we now examine some examples of them. The Maiskaya Mound. An archaeological site known as the Maiskaya Mound is located on top of a volcanic hill near Phanagoria in the Asian Bosporus. The remains of a building, considered by the initial excavator to be either a treasury or a temple in Antes, were uncovered in the course of archaeological explorations in the 1960s, Mochenko 1963. The location of this sanctuary was not accidental. Its peculiar feature is a natural cleft, 12 m long, almost 2 m deep, and 3 m wide, flanked by two active mud volcanoes. The sanctuary remains largely unexcavated, but this cleft was filled with numerous votives, including 1164 terracotta figurines. The prevailing types among these figurines were female protomes, terracotta busts made in a single mold, most commonly associated with Demeter and Kore. All figurines were of local production. Based on a careful analysis of all the finds, it has been established that the terracottas found in the cleft date from the mid-5th through the mid-3rd century BCE, whereas the sanctuary remained in operation until the 1st century BCE, Ileina 2010, 425. It remains unclear whether the cleft was used as a favissa, a reservoir for the discarded gifts, the property of the deities, from the sanctuary, or whether the worshippers were depositing their votives into the cleft themselves. If Demeter and Kore Persephone were indeed the main deities venerated here, an opening in the ground between the two mouths of the mud volcano seems like the most logical place for the offerings. The Boris and Gleb Mound. In the early 19th century, on the mound of Boris and Gleb, in the Taman Peninsula, as a result of an eruption of a mud volcano followed by a landslide, the remains of a sanctuary were uncovered. The site yielded two dedicatory inscriptions, both dated to the second half of the 4th century BCE. One mentions a temple dedicated to Artemis Agrotora, CIRB 1014, on behalf of Xenoclides. The other is a statue base inscribed to the mighty gods Sanages and Astara, CIRB 1015, two deities of unknown, but most probably non-Greek, origin. According to the inscription, the latter dedication was set up on behalf of Commissary, daughter of Gorgippos and wife of Perisides. Although Commissary appears in her dedication as a private person, she should be identified as a member of the Spartacidae dynasty, wife of the Bosporan king Perisides I, 3443-31110 BCE, and daughter of Gorgippos, the uncle of the latter. Two fragmentary limestone statues were found nearby and could belong with the inscribed pedestal, although this is not certain. A statue that might be a representation of Astara is an almost life-sized figure dressed in a long, high-belted chiton. The head is missing. The statue believed to represent Sanages is now lost, but reportedly it was a cloaked figure of a man. Aphrodite in the Asian and European Bosporus. It seems that all the sanctuaries associated with the mud volcanoes, which we have examined here, were connected with female deities of a Chthonian nature, as the dedicatory inscriptions and numerous terracotta figurines testify. Likewise, the cult of Aphrodite of Apatoros probably also had Chthonian connotations and might have been related to the phenomenon of the mud volcanoes. Although this cult is attested on both sides of the straits, it appears to have been much more prevalent in the Asian Bosporus, Taman Peninsula. Of particular interest are dedicatory inscriptions that contain the following epicleses: Aphrodite Urania, CIRB 972, Aphrodite Urania the mistress of Apatoros, Aphrodite Urania Apatoru Mediusa, CIRB 31, 35, 75, 971, 1111, and Aphrodite Apatoriada, CIRB 1045. Strabo mentions two sites in the Asian Bosporos connected with this cult: Apatoros, the sanctuary of Aphrodite, and a notable temple of Aphrodite Apatoros in Phanagoria, Strab. The 11th of February 2010, he then attempts to explain the etymology of this epiclesis by linking it to the Greek word apate, treachery, through the following story. The giants once attacked the goddess in the area, and in order to punish them she called upon Heracles and hid him in a cave. As the impatient giants were arriving to be received by the goddess in the cave, she gave them one by one to Heracles to be murdered through treachery. The origin of this myth is unclear. It could be considered as one of the colonizing myths through which Greeks laid claim to foreign territories. Malkin 1987, 90, Doherty 1993, 136-56. On the other hand, because of the erotic and comic undertones of the story Aphrodite luring the giants into the cave, it has been proposed that Strabo may have actually used a text of a mime, a type of comic theatrical performance, as a source for his story, Toktasiv 1983. Nonetheless, what is important here is the uncanny connection between a cave and a goddess. Ivanchik 2010, 323. Her cult must have had Chthonian connotations as well, linking it to the Chthonian cults of Demeter and Koi Persephone. To this day, neither the location of Apatoros nor the exact origins of the cult are known. There exists a popular argument that Aphrodite Urania was an amalgamation of a goddess of Scythian and or of Sindo-Myotian origins with a Greek goddess, Ustinova 1999, 29-53, Shorp 2007, 80-123. Unfortunately, there is no evidence to support this assumption and it has recently been challenged. Toktasiv 1986, Koshelenko 2010, 361-3. Indeed, it is unlikely that the cult of Aphrodite in the Bosporos had anything to do with the mysterious and rather elusive great goddess of the Myotians, or Scythians, or Scythians, Koshelenko 2010, 379. Thus far, no traces of Sindo-Myotian sanctuaries have been discovered anywhere in the Taman Peninsula, and the relationship with the Scythians, at least for the first 2 centuries of the Apoikiai's existence, was mostly confrontational. In addition, practically nothing is known about the religious beliefs of the Scythians. Our only source on the subject is Herodotus, and it has to be treated with great caution. 2 passages in his histories are used as evidence to demonstrate a Scythian connection with the cult of Aphrodite. The first passage, HDT 4.8-9, recounts one of the versions of the origins of the Scythians, where a snake-legged maiden lures Heracles into a cave and afterwards gives birth to 3 sons, one of which becomes the forefather of all Scythians. In the second passage, HDT 4.59, the Scythian goddess Ogympasa is compared with the Greek Aphrodite, among other deities. Although associations between a Chthonian female deity and a cave crevice are apparent, this is definitely not enough to postulate a Greek, barbarian connection in the cult of Aphrodite in the Bosporos. It has been suggested that the cult of Aphrodite in general, and of Aphrodite Urania in particular, spread into the European Bosporos from the Taman Peninsula, where it seems to have been more prominent in the 4th century BCE, Olaric 2009, 199-202, Koshelenko 2010, 379-80. The earliest dedication to Aphrodite Urania found in the European Bosporos dates from the 2nd century BCE, CIRB 75. It should be noted, though, that the cult of Aphrodite, not necessarily with the epiclesis Urania, could have arrived in the cities of the European Bosporos independently, with the Milesian colonists, CCIRB 7, 13, 17. Relatively recently, in the course of the archaeological excavations in Miletus, an archaic sanctuary of Aphrodite has been excavated, thus proving what scholars had long suspected, that a cult of Aphrodite in Miletus existed as early as the beginning of the 6th century BCE, Earhart 1983, 164-6, Greaves 2004. It seems that the mud volcanoes on both sides of the Cimmerian Bosporos were considered by the Greek colonists as indicators of sacred spots appropriate for sanctuaries. Because of the underworld connotations of these sites, it is usually assumed that the deities worshipped there were of a Chthonian nature. As some of these sanctuaries have not been thoroughly investigated, it remains impossible to determine whether there was any cultic activity before the coming of the Greeks. The so-called Scindian half-figures. It seems that the natural phenomenon of mud volcanoes influenced the ideas of the Bosporan Greeks about the underworld, and this found its manifestation in a group of funerary monuments. The notion of anodos, movement upwards, has long been associated with Koi Persephone and her ascent back to her mother Demeter. A number of long busts or half-figures, presumably representing Koi or other female Chthonian goddesses, appear in the Mediterranean from the 5th century BCE onwards, Sturgeon 1975. Although only a small group in total, the specimens have been found in diverse locations, such as Kyrene in North Africa, some islands of the southwestern Aegean, Sicily, and southern Italy. The majority of these demostatues represent female characters, and only in the Roman period do a few male examples make their appearance, Sturgeon 1975, 231, 232. The general consensus is that they all served as funerary monuments, but only rarely did they represent the deceased, rather, they have been understood as Chthonian goddesses rising to receive the dead, Sturgeon 1975, 235. The tradition of marking the graves with half-figures appears independently among some of the inhabitants of the Bosporan kingdom. A group of about 70 locally produced limestone sculptures, found mostly on the Asian side of the Bosporos, although several examples have been found on the European side as well, were first associated with the Scindians by the excavator N.I. Sokolsky. However, there is no particular reason to link them with these people, who, by the mid-5th century BCE, were heavily Hellenized and whose material culture probably did not differ from that of the Bosporan Greeks. Although, unfortunately, all the half-figures were found in secondary contexts, their identification as funerary monuments is fairly certain. They should be dated from between the 3rd and the 1st century BCE. The Bosporan semifigures are rather consistent in their iconography. Men and women are represented in relief, on stelae, or in the round, as freestanding statues, and all are cut off at the level of the mid-thigh. Since it is quite certain that these half-figures do not represent the ascending deities, but the deceased, they should probably be understood as representing a descent to the underworld, Cathodos. Produced and found in the areas surrounded by the mud volcanoes, this Bosporan sculptural tradition appears to illustrate Greek beliefs about the underworld, which, in turn, were undoubtedly influenced by local geological phenomenon, Murat forthcoming. Other gods. Among other deities whose cults are attested in the Bosporan kingdom from the 6th through the 1st centuries BCE, we find some of the usual suspects of the Greek pantheon. Zeus is mentioned on a number of graffiti from the 4th century BCE, whereas inscriptions on larger monuments survive only from the Roman period, Schorb 2007, 368-9, with literature. It is possible that Athena did not attain popularity among the Bosporans or that the traces of her cult have not been well preserved throughout the region. However, there are indications that she may have occupied a place of some importance at the court of the Spartocidae. Among the debris of the Basileia in Panticapion, a magnificent marble head of an over life-sized statue has been found. This head, which initially depicted a goddess crowned with a metal stephan, diadem, did undergo some iconographic modifications in the early second half of the 3rd century BCE. The stephan was removed, the hair on top and on the back of the head chiseled off, and a new headdress, most probably a metal helmet, to judge from the additional holes, and a large iron clamp added. The new appearance of the statue probably reflected the new identity of the goddess, that of Athena. It is also not coincidental that an image of Athena in a Corinthian helmet appears on the coins of Leucontou around the same time, Tolstikov 2003, 729. Dedications to Heracles on vessels are known from the 5th century, while dedicatory inscriptions on marble and limestone pedestals, found on both sides of the Bosporos, date from the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, CIRB 16, 973, 1036. Several votive reliefs depicting a standing or reclining Heracles are known from the 3rd century BCE, not to mention, in addition, numerous terracotta figurines of the hero, most of them produced locally from the 3rd through 1st centuries BCE. The cult of Hermes is attested by graffiti dating from the 5th to 4th centuries BCE. A 3rd century BCE inscription from the Asian Bosporos is of particular interest since it mentions agonistic races by youths in honor of Hermes, Gjdutwich 1971, 233. Dionysos always seems to have been popular in the Bosporan kingdom, as attested by a number of his marble statues and statuettes from the 4th to 3rd centuries BCE. There might have been a sanctuary of the god and a theatre in Panticapion, Polyane. v. 44, Gjdutwich 1971, 175, but neither have been located yet. A 4th century BCE dedication to Dionysos contains a rather rare epiclesis Araeos, CIRB 15. Recently, a unique archaeological complex, dating from the first half of the 4th century BCE, has been uncovered in Nymphaeon. More than 50 elaborate architectural details forming a propylon, monumental entrance, to a Temenos have been found. Particularly noteworthy is a large fragment of an inscribed architrave, Theopropides son of Megacles, while holding a post of a gonothete, dedicated this propylon to Dionysos, Sokolova 2003, 771, 2005. Archaeological investigations of this exceptional complex still continue. The cult of Dionysos seems to have received a second wind with the coming of Mithridates VI Eupator Dionysos in the last quarter of the 2nd century BCE, and retained its popularity into the 1st century CE. Cybele, known in the Bosporos as Meta, Ma, Phrygian mother, and perhaps Angeis, CIRB 27, was popular in the classical and Hellenistic period. In addition to graffiti that contain the name of Cybele dating from the 5th through the 2nd centuries, there are also dedicatory inscriptions, CIRB 21, and several votive limestone reliefs from the 1st century BCE, representing Cybele flanked by Hermes and Hecate. Terracotta figurines of Cybele are attested from the 5th century BCE, and by the 3rd century BCE they are by far the most numerous group. Having surveyed a combination of the materials that pertain to official, large dedicatory inscriptions and statues, coins, and popular, terracotta figurines, graffiti, worship, it is apparent that, by and large, from the 6th through the 1st centuries BCE, the Pantheon in the Bosporan kingdom comprised deities typical of a Greek city of Asia Minor origins. Conclusion. As the Greeks explored new territories in the northern Black Sea, they certainly came into contact with diverse peoples, both sedentary and nomadic. They might have been influenced to a certain degree by some new religious ideas and even might have adopted and adapted some of them for their own use. However, there is very little evidence to support a claim that the religious beliefs of the settlers were influenced by the local non-Greek people. No compelling example of Greco-barbarian religious syncretism has been found yet, at least prior to the 1st century CE. Throughout almost 4 centuries of Bosporan history, from the 6th through the 2nd centuries BCE, only 4 deities with non-Greek names have been recorded. Astara and Sanages, CIRB 1015, received a dedication in the second half of the 4th century BCE in the Asian Bosporos. The other 2 are Angeis, CIRB 27, probably a derivative from Cybele-related Agdistis, Radit 1909, 58-60, and Ditagoya, a goddess of unknown origin worshipped by a Scythian princess in the sanctuary of Artemis Hecate. Both goddesses were venerated in Panticapion in the second half of the 2nd century BCE. Religious life in the Bosporos undoubtedly reflected historical and political changes within the state. After the Bosporan kingdom was incorporated into the domain of Mithridates VI, some cults, Mithridates, men, were imported from Asia Minor and Pontos, Saprakin 2009. Although the Bosporos was never part of the Roman Empire officially, it was certainly closely observed and occasionally managed by it and, to a certain degree, received artistic and religious influences. The Bosporan rulers of the 1st century CE styled themselves Philokaza and Philoromanos, friend of Caesar and of the Roman people, and occasionally served as priests of the imperial cult, which was fairly widespread in the area. Koshelenko 2010, 357. Suggested reading. The language barrier remains the largest obstacle for students and scholars interested in the culture and religion of the northern Black Sea in antiquity, as the majority of works are written in Russian. Ustinova 1999 provides a substantial overview of literature, but deals mostly with the cults of Aphrodite and Theos Hypsistos. A recent collection of articles dealing with the religious monuments of the Black Sea, including its northern part, is useful, although the translations of several articles are a bit confusing. Petropolis and Maslenikov 2010. The most up-to-date overview of recent literature, and of archaeological and epigraphic materials from the Bosporos relating to religion, is to be found in Ivono Helrika's 2009 doctoral dissertation. Chapter 40. The Ancient Near East. Jan N. Bremer. Introduction. Serious study of the connections between Greek religion and the ancient Near East started at the end of the 19th century, when the German classicist Otto Grupp (1851–1921), Bils 1921, Casadio 2009, 146–7, published a massive review of Greek cults and myths in their relationships to Oriental religions. He analyzed the religious transfers to the Greeks from the Assyrians, Phoenicians, Phrygians, and Egyptians, but not the Persians. Grupp 1887, Marchand 2009, 232–3. His book was mainly based on snippets of knowledge that have been preserved by ancient Greek and Roman authors, but barely on sources in the original languages, although Grupp knew Hebrew and some Assyrian. His project clearly was much too ambitious, as knowledge of the original cultures, languages, and religions of the ancient Near East was still in its infant stages. In fact, it has continued to develop slowly, and is still making progress today through the steady trickle of new texts and inscriptions. It would be a century before Walter Burkert, 1931–2015, renewed scholarly interest in the influence of the Near East on Greek religion and culture. This became the most prominent part of his work in the 1980s and 1990s, leading to two fundamental publications: The Orientalizing Revolution, 1992, first German edition 1984, and Babylon, Memphis, Persepolis, 2004, in addition to an important series of accompanying articles, Burkert 2003. Whereas the first book concentrated on the transmitters of Oriental religious practices, such as traveling charismatics, see section the carriers of the religious transfers, and the connections with Akkadian literature, such as Athrahasis and Enuma Elish, see section ritual, mythical, and cultic transfers from Anatolia and the Levant. The second cast its net wider and also looked for Greek connections with Persia, see section influence from Persia and Egypt. In addition to Burkert, Martin West has also displayed a profound interest in the Near East, from his earliest work to his major contribution on the literary influences of the Near East on Greek poetry and myth, West 1997, and the first volume of his collected papers, West 2011. Undoubtedly, an important factor in the favorable reception of Burkert and West has been the fierce debate that arose from the publication of Martin Bernal's Black Athena, Bernal 1987–2006. Although his results have been widely rejected, Lefkowitz and Rogers 1996, Bernal raised consciousness about the influence of Africa and the Near East on ancient Greece. In contrast to his wild etymologies, naive approach to the sources, and general neglect of the archaeological evidence, the generally sound methodology and obvious command of the philological evidence in Burkert's and West's work has been a relief. Even if West's parallels are not always convincing, Dowden 2001, Wasserman 2001, and Burkert's etymological proposals not always persuasive, Stoll 2004, their work has been the basis for all subsequent studies. For examples, see suggested reading. But how should we phrase what we are doing? Are Greek religion and the ancient Near East really satisfactory terms when it comes to serious research? As regards the first term, it is obvious that we can quarrel about its utility. The increasing attention to local religion has shown that each Greek polis had its own pantheon and rituals. Yet the overlap or family resemblance between different polis also suggests it is not really helpful to speak of Greek religions. See further, on such questions, in this volume, Osborne, Chapter 1. It is somewhat different with the ancient Near East. The term Near East was coined at the end of the 19th century after the Far East had come into being and, originally, even included the Balkans. Gradually, it came to mean the area that is also nowadays referred to as Middle East, Van Dongen 2014, although it normally leaves out Western Anatolia and sometimes Egypt. Moreover, it suggests a unity that was certainly not there, and I will use the term primarily as a geographical unit running from Western Anatolia to Iran, but with the exclusion of Egypt, which is covered in a different contribution, this volume, Gleb, Chapter 41. It is clear, though, that the Near East is an umbrella term that covers a wide area in time and place. We only need to think of the old Akkadian, Hittite, Assyrian, Babylonian, and Persian empires, not to mention the Hurrian, Luwian, Carian, Lycian, Lydian, 3 languages related to Luwian, Melchett 2003, Yakubovich 2010, Phrygian, and Phoenician languages, in order to realize that we are speaking about many languages and cultures that had different contacts in many different ways with Greece or, perhaps better, Greeks, over a period of time that spans many centuries. Moreover, people may have spoken one language in daily life and used another for writing or ritual prescriptions. People may have been deported to places different from their original territory or become dominated by empires with a different language. Some cultures were less porous than others. The Hittites welcomed all kinds of foreign gods, but the Mesopotamians did not. In other words, we have to be very careful in distinguishing between culture, language, and political entity. The continuing discovery of archaeological artifacts and increasing knowledge of the different texts and languages of the area under discussion make it virtually impossible for a single person to follow the most recent developments and their relationship to ancient Greek religion. For example, the discovery of a new Hittite text in 2002, called Ea and the Beast, contains new evidence on the role of the Mesopotamian Hurrian god Ea, Rutherford 2011, who was also in the background of the Prometheus of Aeschylus, Stephanie West 1994, 145-9. The name of the Iliadic, Lycian hero Sarpedon has now been shown to belong to a Lycocarian family of names, Sha 2013a, and even the famous encounters of Odysseus with Nausicaa and with the Cyclops now have, almost certainly, Oriental ancestries, George 2012, Zgol 2012. In a way, then, every contribution on the topic is a preliminary exploration that can get out of date very quickly. With that proviso, I will focus on some exemplary problems where new discoveries enable us to advance our knowledge, and limit myself to the most recent publications in this respect. In thinking about the influence of the Near East on Greek religion, it will be helpful to distinguish 2 types of religious transfers. First, those from Mesopotamian, Hurrian Hittite, Phoenician, and Persian religious systems, and, secondly, those from the Epicoric religions, especially Luwian, Hutter 2003, Carian, Debord 2009, and Lycian, Fry 1990, Newman 1994, 178-90, as well as Phrygian, Hutter 2006, Strobel 2010, which were encountered by the Greeks immigrating to Anatolia and slowly integrated by them into a religious system that still preserved part of its age-old, albeit fragmented, tradition, Rutherford 2006. The former have been studied much more than the latter, due to the fact that the Luwian, Carian, and Lycian languages have become known better only very recently, so I will pay more attention to them, see section transfers from the Luwians, Lycians, and Carians, than to the second type, see section ritual, mythical, and cultic transfers from Anatolia and the Levant. In both cases, though, we are faced with the problem of the roots and the carriers of these transfers, see section the carriers of the religious transfers. We will close with some observations on the Persians, which have been studied least in this respect at this point, see section influence from Persia. Transfers from the Luwians, Lycians, and Carians. Hittite sources mention a country called Ozawa with a most important city Apasa, the later Greek Ephesos, which covered much of the area later known as Lydia and its surroundings. Its population spoke Luwian, Carian, Lycian, and Lydian, and quite a few indigenous names and religious traditions survived in Korea, Lycia, and Cilicia well into the Roman period, albeit often in Greek guise. Bryce 2003, 101-4, Parker 2013. Originally, there was not a single national religious system but a series of local pantheons. Hutter 2003, 218, Rutherford 2006, 140, with, presumably, local and national rituals. In the course of time, many local gods seem to have become incorporated in Hellenized pantheons, but they still had recognizable epithets of non-Greek origin, such as Zeus Arsagallis or Zeusasogo, as. Even if these epithets have defied interpretation so far, they are certainly of Anatolian origin. Only the most prominent gods of the native population will have survived the many political changes, albeit in ways that reflected their original identity and representation only partially. For example, the name of the chief god of the Hittite and Luwian pantheon, the storm god Tarhunt, survived in Anatolian onomastics well into Hellenistic times. Hutter 2003, 221, Adiego 2007, 331-2, and c. in this volume, Lopez Ruiz, Chapter 25. Given his role as god of the storm with its concomitant lightning as well as with might and strength, Hutter 2003, 220-4, Zeus Stratios, of the army of Lebranda, probably continued this old god, as he is usually depicted with the Hittite Luwian double axe, Teftela 2012. Other epithets of Zeus in Korea, such as Areos and Strategos, also point to this military Zeus, all of them probably being reflections of an ancient Carian god, views Dieucarian, related to Tarhunt, Lormania 1958, 187. One manifestation of the Luwian storm god was Pihasasi, the storm god of lightning. As he was closely associated with the horse, it is most interesting that the horse Pegasos, whose name derives from that Luwian god, Hutter 2003, 223, was especially worshipped in Korea and Lycia, Lormania 1958, 205-7, Bremer 2013, 68. Another striking aspect of the storm god was his connection with vineyards, Hutter 2003, 224. Now precisely in central Anatolia, in Phrygia, another area with a Luwian substrate, we find Zeus Ampelites, of the vineyard, Robert 1987, 338, 340, 368, 373-86, Drubert and Thomas 1999, 253 ff, 318 ff, 355 ff, 372, SEG 57.1311, who clearly also had his roots in Luwian religion and who may help us to explain a problem of the mythology of Dionysos. Greek inscriptions from Lydia mention a meter Hypt who is worshipped together with Zeus Sabazios, Paz de Hoz 1999, 40.19-21. This Hypt is known as the nurse of Dionysos from the early CE Orphic hymns, 48, 49, see more and 2001, 174-81, but she has now also turned up as his mother or a woman, nurse, who is described as happening upon him in a new, late 3rd century BCE papyrus, Obink 2011, 291-4, about the birth of the god. His father, Zeus, is identified with Sabazios, and the story is located in Lydian Myonia, where all the inscriptions concerning Hypt are found. Now Hypt is the local form of Hebat, a Syrian Anatolian goddess who was incorporated into the Hittite pantheon, where she became the consort of the storm god Teshub, Tremui 1997, 41-2, this couple surely being the ancestors of the couple Hypt and Zeus, Sabazios. Interestingly, although Hebat is not found in Hittite texts beyond the river Halys, although she was worshipped in Kitsuwatna, her worship must have expanded westwards, as she was also known in Lycia, Newman 1994, 171-4, 308, Sh 2011, 219, which makes her survival in Lydia the more probable. Her expansion perhaps took place in the time of the Neo-Hittite, Assyrian, or even Lydian empires, as Gyges made strong overtures to the Assyrians, West 2011, 351-2. But why would Dionysos have been connected to this Hypt? Can it be that the association of Anatolian Zeus with grapes played an important role in this respect? Next to the storm god, the Luwians worshipped the sun god, Hutta 2003, 224-7. Although Helios is a very minor god in the Greek pantheon, Mausolos, the famous 4th century BCE ruler of Korea, derived his ancestry from this particular god, perhaps because the sun god seems to have survived as the Carian deity Sinui, Dale forthcoming A. The only place in Greece where Helios was really important was Rhodes, where one could find many curious sites religieuses and where the cult of Helios was clearly old. Tres Anciens, Lormania 1958, 682-4. It is here, the island at the periphery of Korea and Lycia, that we would expect ancient Anatolian gods, such as the sun god, to survive. Finally, one of the most famous gods of ancient Greece was Artemis of Ephesos, whose famous outfit of oval pendants hanging from her chest, called breasts since the Church Father Jerome, has long defied satisfactory interpretation. In recent years, however, it has been persuasively suggested that these should be traced back to the Hittite cursor, Boris 2001 AB, more cautiously, Hutta 2003, 268-9, a leather hunting bag sometimes personified as a tutelary divinity, Bremer 2008, 312-17. Indeed, Anatolian influence in Ephesos is the more likely as Ephesian Athena had incorporated the Hittite Luwian goddess Malia, Terracotta 2009, 115, Hawkins 2013, 127-9, also Lycian, Newman 1994, 132-3, 136-7, 188-9, Watkins 2007, 122-5, as Athena Marlies, Hipponax, FR 49.2 Degany 2. Artemis priest was a eunuch, and such priests were typical of Anatolia. Witness the famous Goli of Cybele and Attis in Pessinus, the priests of Hecate of Carian Lagina, and those in the temple of the Goli in Phrygian Hierapolis, Bremer 2008, 288-9, Taylor 2008. Moreover, Hermaphroditos originated in Carian Halicarnassos, and in neighboring Pedissa Athena grew a beard every time the community was threatened from outsiders, Bremer 2009, 298-302, 304. As this playing with biological markers seems to be limited to Western Anatolia, we may suspect a Preluwian influence, but to suggest that we could identify this influence, the Hatti, would be explaining obscurum per obscurius. Ritual, mythical, and cultic transfers from Anatolia and the Levant. Let us now take a closer look at the roots of transmission of two famous transfers, the scapegoat rituals, and the succession myth of Kronos and the Titans. In 1919, shortly after the decipherment of Hittite, the British pioneer Assyriologist Archibald Sayce, 1846-1933, noted the parallel of the Hittite scapegoat ritual with that of Leviticus 16 in the Old Testament. And in 1925, the German Hittitologist Johannes Friedrich, 1893-1972, observed the parallel between the Hittite and a Greek scapegoat ritual, Burkett 1979, 60-1, Bremer 2008, 170-96. We find similar rituals, then, in Israel, among the Hittites and at the Greek west coast of Anatolia. How do we explain this distribution and where did the ritual originate? The largest mention of Anatolian scapegoats occurs in Arzawian ritual texts found in Hatua, although our knowledge of them derives from Hittite ritual compositions, about 1300 BCE, Strauss 2006, 119-33, Collins 2010, 56-9. This has led the Hittitologist Miller, 2004, 466-7, to suggest that Arzawa was the homeland of the scapegoat rituals, which subsequently moved east towards Kitsuwatna, in classical times known as Cilicia, and the Levant. However, his suggestion does not take into account the fact that our oldest testimonies come from Ebla and are dated to about 2350 BCE, thus well before the invasion of Anatolia by the Hittites and Luwians, Bremer 2008, 170. These rites probably moved both southwards towards Israel and to the west in the direction of Cilicia, which was known for its close ritual contacts with the Levant. Miller 2005. From Kitsuwatna, the scapegoat rituals will have been exported to Arzawa, probably via Luwians, rather than Hittites, as Hittite presence in western Anatolia was fairly minimal. Nehemiah 2008, 327-30, Vanschoon-Winkle 2010. From Arzawa, the Ionian Greeks will have appropriated the ritual, perhaps even first in Ephesos, as Hipponax, FR. 6, 26, 30 Degani 2. From Ephesos is our oldest source for the Greek version of the scapegoat ritual, and from southern Ionia the ritual spread to Athens and northern Ionia. Bremer 2008, 175-96. Our second example is the transfer of the Hurrian Hittite succession myth, traditionally called the kingship in heaven cycle. Its opening song was known as Song of Kumarbi, until in 2007 it was noted that its real title was Song of Emergence. Beckman 2011, Van Dongen 2011, 2012. Since 1930, when the Swiss scholar Emil Forer, 1894-1986, Oberheide 2007, first pointed to the resemblance, its contents have often been compared to those of Hesiodd's Theogony, most recently, Rutherford 2007, Van Dongen 2011. This myth of, originally, the Hurrians in North Syria was appropriated both by the Hittites and the Phoenicians. Yet how this myth came to the Greeks is still not wholly clear. Recent studies, Rutherford 2007, Lane Fox 2008, 259-314, Lopez Ruiz 2010, have persuasively derived the succession myth from the Phoenicians, and, as they show, the prominence of the monster Typhon, whose name, whirlwind, typhoon, is related to the Phoenician mountain name Sapon, modern Jebel al-Akra, via folk etymology. Haider 2005, fully supports their arguments. Yet the picture is complicated, and new evidence seems to somewhat nuance this view. Now, Hesiodd's version had passed through Delphi, as he mentions the stone in Delphi that Kronos swallowed instead of Zeus, Theogony 498-500, West 2011, 144. The location means that there was already a version of the myth in circulation before Hesiod. Moreover, the archaic Corinthian poet Eumelos knew a version of the Titanomachy with older motifs than that of Hesiod, West 2011, 355-67. Evidently, there were a number of versions, which, every moment, could be adapted to new input from accounts of the succession myth heard somewhere in the ancient Near East. Rutherford 2007, 31. Yet two problems of the succession myth have not yet been satisfactorily explained: the name of Kronos and the origin of the Titans. Kronos' non-Greek etymology suggests an import from peoples of western Anatolia, such as the Solomoi and Lycians, Shah 2011, 221, who, unlike the Greeks themselves, attached a certain importance to Kronos. Consequently, behind Kronos we have to suspect a Luwian, Hittite, or other indigenous god. An Anatolian background is supported by the fact that his festival, the Kronia, was celebrated only in a very limited area, namely in Samos and its colonies Perinthos and Amorgos, Naxos, Notion Colophon, and Magnesia on the Maeander. Evidently, the origin of Kronos must be looked for in that region in about the 8th century BCE, as the Homeric formula of Kronos with the crooked counsels only fits the meter with the Ionian contraction, which points to a young stage of entry into epic. Bremer 2008, 82. But what about the Titans? They were called the old gods. Old and or dumb people were insulted as Chronoi. An Attic comedy used expressions such as older than Kronos and the Titans. Bremer 2008, 85, updated here. Evidently, the antiquity of this divine generation had become proverbial at a relatively early stage of the tradition. Now, the expression early gods has recently been identified in a Hellenistic Greek grave inscription in Lycia, SEG 58.1605.2, as well as in Lycian epicoric inscriptions, Shah 2011, and persuasively related to the well-known Hittite primeval gods. Moreover, the number 12 of the Titans, West 2007, 162-3, Bremer 2008, 77-8, also points to Anatolia, where groups of 12 gods were well known. The Hittite primeval gods actually consisted of 2 groups of 6 male and female divinities, as in Hesiod, Rutherford 2010, 51-2, Sh 2013b. In fact, the archaic poet Eumelos located the birth of Zeus in Lydia in a tantalizingly brief fragment that has been persuasively assigned to his Titanomachy, West 2011, 356. The location seems to be one more pointer to a connection with Western Anatolia. It seems, then, that various versions of the Near Eastern succession myth reached Greece both via the sea route from the Levant and the land route of Anatolia. Yet there seems to be no indication that the Titanomachy reached Greece via the Levant. Can it be that, originally, the succession myth proper came to Greece via Euboea, which was a major hub for both literary and material Oriental influences in the Archaic Age? Lane Fox 2008, West 2011, 62-3, and that the Titanomachy came or was given new input via the Anatolian route? That is as far as we can go at the moment, as the early process of development of these various versions and their mutual influences wholly escape us. The carriers of the religious transfers. In what ways did the transmission of myths, rituals, and gods take place between the Orient and Greece? Let us start with the myths. Where did the Near East preserve its myths and how were they transmitted? One answer is, of course, that they were recited during rituals. Yet the main mythological epics that influenced Greek mythology probably came along different routes. A recent study of the preservation of Hittite mythological texts, Lorenz and Recon 2009, has concluded that much mythological literature, including Mesopotamian myths, was preserved in the libraries of the lower city of Hatua as material for scribal training. In Mesopotamia we find the same situation, although its scribes exercised with Sumerian rather than Akkadian literature. Interestingly, the same literary and mythological material that was used to train scribes in Hatua was also found in the Amarna letters and in Ugarit. Although we find much less Mesopotamian literature in Ugarit than in Hatua, both Atrahasis and Gilgamesh are attested, the latter with a tablet containing the beginning of the epic, George 2007. The Gilgamesh tablet of Megiddo probably also derives from scribal education, Byrne 2007, 8. Homer took some of his Oriental material from the beginnings of Atrahasis and Enuma Elish, Burkett 1992, 95. Similarly, the Song of Emergence is the first song of the Kumarbi cycle, Bremer 2008, 87-8, and a first tablet of Gilgamesh, as we just saw, was found in Ugarit. Apparently, it was a bilingual Greek or Levantine scribe who started the chain of transmission that eventually resulted in the Near Eastern material appropriated by Homer and Hesiod. Perhaps this scribe gave his material to one of the wandering, possibly also bilingual, West 1997, 607-9, poets of the Near East or Greece, Hunter and Rutherford 2009, West 2011, 344-52. For rituals we have to look in a different direction. Burkett, 1992, has drawn attention to migrating seers and healers as well as public workers as the carriers of religious transfers. See also West 1997, 586-630, Bremer 2008, 133-51, Lopez Ruiz 2010, 171-202. Burkett and West concentrated especially on transmission from the Levant, although we have shown that Western Anatolia should not be neglected either. Hepatoscopy, 2, probably reached Greece via Western Anatolia, Bakvarova 2012, just like augury, Mouton and Rutherford 2013, and not from Mesopotamia, Burkett 1992, 46-51. On the whole, though, the model has kept up well in the last 2 decades, and the stress on the Assyrian Empire as an important factor, West 1997, 614-16, Burkett 2004, 7-11, 23, has only increased through study of the interaction between Greek art and the Orient, Gunter 2009, although contacts between Greeks and the Levant seem to have intensified during the Neo-Babylonian period, Kurt 2002. As regards traveling seers, recent insights and discoveries enable us to improve our understanding in 2 cases. First, Tacitus, Hist. 2.3, mentions a Cypriot seer, Temenos, who came from Cilicia, and whose name has to be connected to a gloss in Hesychios, To 107, mentioning Tamiridai as some priests in Cyprus. His name probably is to be explained from a Hittite word emuanustamara, cult personnel, Egyptmaya 2010, 1.289. Apparently, Cilician seers had moved to Cyprus. One of the oldest Cypriot inscriptions, dating to 750 to 700 BCE and published only in 2001, was found in Cilicia, Egyptmaya 2010, 2.845. A newly discovered Phoenician hieroglyphic Luwian inscription from Cilician Synechoias also contributed to a better understanding of the seer Mopsos whom Greek tradition represented as moving between the Ionian coast and Cilicia, Bremer 2008, 136-43, Lopez Ruiz 2009, Fowler 2013, 546-50, Idenow 2014, 80-2. The form of his name in Mycenaean Greek, Mokoso, demonstrates that, originally, it is Greek not Anatolian, Oettinger 2007, 8-14, Yakubovich 2010, 154-6. Yet the name already occurs in the late 15th century Hittite Madawatar's text of Bagazkoi as Muyukuu, Beckman, Bryce, and Klein 2011, 94-5, who seems to have been a Mycenaean leader, Yakubovich 2010, 154, and indeed, linguistic contact between Greece and Anatolia during the 2nd millennium BCE is well attested, Garcia Ramon 2011. In Greece, in the course of time, the name Moxos developed into Mopsos, following the normal development kilowatt, p. cf. Mycenaean Eko hippos, but the original form maintained itself in Lydia where the 5th century Lydian historian Xanthos mentions an early Lydian king Moxos, even though this has become Mopsos in part of the manuscript tradition. The name occurs no less than 4 times among 40 names in a later 4th century BCE Ephesian inscription about the condemnation to death of inhabitants of Sardis. There even was a rather obscure Lydian city, Moxoupolis, Bremer 2008, 142-3. In the newly discovered inscription, the king himself, the late 8th century Euriki, is said to be an offspring of the house of Mopsos, whereas the Luwian version calls him a grandson of Muk, Sars, Yakubovich 2010, 155, Beckman, Bryce, and Klein 2011, 263-6. This Mopsos does not only carry a Greek name, but is also said to be the grandson of an Hiawan king. Recent linguistic analysis confirms that Ahiyawa was the Hittite name for the Mycenaean Greeks, as has long been suspected. This finding supports the long-standing view that Cilicia was colonized by early Greeks after the fall of the Hittite Empire in the 12th century BCE, Oreshko 2013. Evidently, the Phoenicians had heard the name in its later form, Mopsos, whereas the Luwians continued to call him by the older form Muxos. Clearly, Mopsos' name stands at the crossroads of Greek, Phoenician, and Luwian traditions, which, in their entanglement, show us that we should be reticent in identifying cultural influences all too specifically and keep in mind the fluid nature of religious and other cultural transfers. Rightly, Lopez Ruiz 2009, 498-9. Finally, attention to poets, seers, and other religious specialists should not blind us to the possibility of other channels. As regards the transmission of gods, who, for example, was responsible for the transmission of Adonis to Greece? Given that his rituals were practiced exclusively by women and are attested first in the work of a female poet, Sappho, Fr 140a, 168 Voigt, is it unthinkable that they were introduced from the Levant by wives of Greek merchants or mercenaries or even female Oriental slaves? West 1997, 618-21? We will probably never know, but the question should be posed. Influence from Persia? Although the influence of Persia on Greek religion has been the subject of more sustained argument only very recently, Burkett 2004, 99-124, Hawkey 2009, Heraclitos, Fr 22dk, already ascribes a certain ritual influence to Persian Magoi, as they are grouped together with all kinds of people practicing initiations. As Ephesos had already been under Persian dominance for more than 40 years at the time of Heraclitus' writing, and the priest of its main goddess, Artemis, even had acquired a Persian name, Megabixos, Bremer 2008, 353-6, these might have been freelance Magoi rather than official Persian priests. The gradual rise of the concept of magic in the course of the later 5th century, Bremer 2008, 235-48, supports the interpretation of these Magoi as itinerant priests. The interpretation has gained weight with the publication of the Dervini Papyrus, which contains a most interesting description of a ritual practiced by Magoi in Athens at the turn of the 5th century, columns 6.1-7. Libations and sacrifices appease the Artades, those who possess the truth, i.e. the ancestors, and the incantation of the Magoi is able to drive away the daemons when they get in the way. Daemons are very able to get in the way of the souls. This is why the Magoi perform the sacrifice, just as if they were paying a penalty. And on the offerings they pour water and milk, from which they also make the libations. New text, Ferrari 2011, 75-7. The text continues with further ritual details, but, for our purpose, it is enough to see that the Magoi had not only preserved their rituals but even some of their traditional terminology, as Artades is an old Zoroastrian term, deriving from West Iran, Bruce 2005, 122-4. On the other hand, water libations were alien to Iranian religion. Apparently, the Magoi had adapted their ritual to that of the Greeks who did libate with water, Bremer 2008, 245. Moreover, the fact that the Magoi operated as if they had to pay a penalty brings them suspiciously close to the Orphics, who also promoted payments for the sins of the ancestors, Ferrari 2011, 79. The Magoi seem to have tried to bring their ritual and message closer to what other itinerant priests, such as the Orphiotlists, had to offer at the time. This way of proceeding is, of course, not strange. Modern sociology of religion teaches us that new religions are the more successful the closer they come to the existing ruling religions, Stark and Finker 2000. Evidently, the Magoi had already learned this lesson. Conclusion. Following the investigations of the last 3 decades, there can be no doubt whatsoever that the ancient Near East influenced and enriched Greek religion. Yet this influence was not felt all over Greece or accepted in all Greek milieux. To give 2 examples, whereas Samos has been found to be a treasure full of oriental goods and clearly was a kind of archaic trading hub, neighboring Chios has given us virtually no oriental material, Gunter 2009, 129-30. Second example, whereas we might think that Hesiod had established an oriental-influenced theogony as the ruling paradigm, early mythographers, except for Akusilaus, FRR. 6-22 Fowler, and Pseudo-Epimenides, FRR. 6-13 Fowler, only rarely referred to it, lesbian poets do not even seem to have used it at all, West 2011, 392-407, although Lesbos, Hittite Laspa, was an important interface between the Neo-Hittites and the Eastern Aegean, Bremer 2008, 317, Dale 2011, Teftela 2013, Dale forthcoming B. This rarity of the theogony makes its employment in Orphism perhaps even more significant. The poet whom the ancient Greeks called Orpheus clearly opted for a model that was not generally accepted. Having established the general importance of the ancient Near East for Greek religion, future research should thus look for the geographical and social spread of this influence, as well as for the modifications of that influence in the course of the transmission and reception. The problem of the Orient and its influence will not quickly find a satisfying solution. Suggested reading. For an excellent survey of the work by Burkett in this field, see Casadio 2009. In addition to Burkett and West, see, in general, Bremer 2008, Lane Fox 2008, and Lopez Ruiz 2010, 2014, but also more specialized studies, such as those by Bakvarova 2005, 2009, 2012, Burnaby 2004, 2006, 2004, 2008, 2011, Van Dongen 2007-2013, Petty 2011, Rollinger 2001, 2003, 2004, 2012, Rutherford 2006-2011, and Watkins, 1933-2013, 2008. For the contacts between the Hittites and the Mycenaeans, Gens 2011, 303-9 is an up-to-date survey. Chapter 41. Greco-Egyptian Religion. Catherine Kleibel ***. Introduction. Greek sources from the 5th century BCE show a strong interest in Egypt. Herodotus devoted a book of his histories to the land on the Nile, paying particular attention to Egyptian religion, which he considered a source for true understanding of Greek cults. He identified the Egyptian goddess Isis with the Greek Demeter and Io, Osiris with Dionysos, Amun with Zeus, Horus with Apollo, Bastet with Artemis, Anatha with Aphrodite, HDT 2.42 ff. All forms of divination, according to Herodotus, had originated in Egypt, as had the first major religious festivals and processions. He assumed the daughters of the Egyptian king Danaos brought the mysteries of the Greek goddess Demeter to Greece. He also stated that the teachings of the Orphics and Dionysiac mysteries came from Egypt, and that a certain Melampos imported the cult of Dionysos, with the procession of the Phallos, into Greece. In Egypt, during the Ptolemies' 300-year rule, the Greeks represented the ruling class. As a result, they grew closer to certain Egyptian gods, in particular, Osiris, Serapis, Isis, Horus, and Anubis. Along with traveling merchants, the Ptolemaic dynasty was a decisive driving force for the dissemination of these now Hellenized Egyptian deities, which were clearly connected with the dynastic cult. Serapis, a conflation of Osiris and the bull god Apis, was raised to the status of the Ptolemaic dynastic god. His main sanctuary was built in Egyptian Alexandria, Stambul 1972, Kessler 1989, 56-101. Archaeological evidence for the worship of Egyptian gods in Greek lands can be found in Athens from the 4th century BCE. Egyptians, probably sailors and merchants, were permitted to build a temple to Isis in the port of Piraeus, Risis 1010-101. Sanctuaries in other port cities of the eastern Mediterranean soon followed. Prominent examples are the 3 places of worship on the island of Delos, see further, in this volume, Scott, Chapter 16, and the sanctuary at Eretria in Euboea, Greco 2001. Greco-Egyptian cult grew rapidly, first in the area of Greek culture, then in the western Mediterranean. MYT. No full text summarizing the myth of the Egyptian family of gods has survived from pharaonic times. In the 1st century CE, however, Plutarch recorded the story in the Greek treatise on Isis and Osiris. Relying mostly on Egyptian sources, he collected various pharaonic traditions, episodes, and images into a homogeneous myth in narrative form. One of the most important sections of the myth relates the resurrection of Osiris by Isis, after his murder by Seth, and the subsequent wedding of the dead, Plut. Der Isget Os. 18. In Tears, Isis collects all of Osiris' parts except for his Phallos, eaten by the fish of the Nile, then seeks help from the jackal-headed Anubis, god of mummification. Together they revive Osiris, but not to full earthly life. He remains lord of the underworld, and the only part of him that returns to earth is a Phallos, embodying fertility and the life force. Isis presents it to him during the following wedding of the dead, in which she appears as a female falcon to her husband in the realm of the dead, in order to produce another Horus child with him. This child is basically another manifestation of Horus, called Horus the Younger. Osiris prepares his son Horus for vengeance and struggle against his murderer Seth, a struggle that Horus wins, thenceforth serving as ruler pharaoh of Egypt, Plut. Der Isget Os. 19, 36, 38. The Greco-Egyptian Pantheon. Osiris. In Egypt, Osiris is identified by name by the end of the 5th dynasty, Mosof 2005, Kleibel 2009, 22. He was the god of the dead, for whom the first rites of death connected with an afterlife were performed. In the Middle Kingdom, Osiris began to be approximated to the Egyptian pharaoh and became king of the underworld. In late Egyptian times, Osiris was one of the most dominant gods of Egypt, standing hierarchically even above the pharaoh. He was worshipped especially as a fertility god, symbolizing the land of Egypt, and the crops of the land sprouted from his body. A particular aspect of Osiris was his identification with the water of the Nile, which was considered to be his semen. Osiris was thus the Nile, the giver of life to Egypt. He died when the Nile dried up and he was reborn when its flooding made the land fertile. Gleb 2009, 154f. Osiris was not adopted into the Greco-Egyptian pantheon in his Egyptian form. For the Greeks, the representation of a dead god was unusual. Although he was identified by Herodotus with Dionysos, another Hellenized god took Osiris' place beside the goddess Isis, the already mentioned Serapis. Osiris was not worshipped outside Egypt as a physically tangible deity, but he still had a symbolic role in cultic practice. He symbolized transformation and flow through his self-renewal and change. In their initiation into the community of faith, the mysteries, the followers of the Hellenized Isis cult relived the death and resurrection of Osiris in their own bodies. Although there were no cult images of Osiris, he was still honored in his manifestation as water, as a 2nd century BCE dedication from Thessaloniki makes clear. Phylicides erected a temple to Osiris with a hollow chamber containing water. In this chamber the god moves around in the starlit night and brings joy to Isis. From the 1st century BCE, canopic jars containing the sacred waters of the Nile, vessels with the head of the god as a cover, called Osiris Hydreios figures, were placed in the sanctuaries. Isis. Isis is attested in Egyptian religion from around 2400 BCE in epigraphic sources, not as a goddess but as a priestess. Gleb 2009, 20-2. The pyramid and coffin texts place Isis as a mourner at the foot of the bier during the embalming process, while her sister Nephthys stood at the head end. Isis deification during the 5th dynasty is associated with the appearance of Osiris. In the Middle Kingdom she was understood as the wife of the deceased ruler and pharaoh in the underworld. She was also recognized by ordinary Egyptians as the goddess of the dead. In the New Kingdom, the phonic role of Isis became that of a mother and sky deity. The pharaohs now referred to themselves as the sons of Isis, and her womb was regarded as a royal throne. Her name means throne or seat. In the 19th dynasty, 1292–1190 BCE, the worship of Isis reached its first climax and she rose to the status of a universal goddess, absorbing the essence of the other Egyptian goddesses. Egyptian queens identified themselves with Isis, a tradition adopted by Ptolemaic rulers. Greek religion of the 4th century BCE was particularly receptive to savior deities with maternal, helping, or healing functions. Thanks to her universality, the Egyptian Isis, an all-embracing, transnational, transcultural, and transreligious world goddess, was integrated with little difficulty into the Greco-Egyptian pantheon. Of particular importance in this connection are the aretalogies that concern self-revelations put in the mouth of Isis, a text that lists her miracles and characteristics. The aretalogies were inscribed on stelae in certain sanctuaries of gods outside Egypt, such as in Caim, Rhysis 3020204, in Thessaloniki, Rhysis 11305545, in Thracian Maroneia, Rhysis 11400202, in Telmessos, Rhysis 30600201, and on iOS, Rhysis 2021101, and Andros, IG12, 5739. The earliest dates from the 1st century BCE, the latest from the 3rd century CE. They purport to be verbatim copies of a 3rd century BCE Memphian archetype from the Temple of Hephaestos. One of these tablets was probably placed in each sanctuary outside Egypt and used in daily worship. Their textual style shows strong affinities with the hymns of Egyptian origin that were known to be sung by priests. Horus Hypocrates. Horus is the son of Isis and Osiris and an important member of the family of the gods. Horus, the child Harpar shared in the original Egyptian, was Hellenized into Harpocrates. As in Egypt, in Greco-Roman culture, he was represented in human form as a child with his finger to his mouth. In Egypt this gesture was still considered a symbol of childhood, but the adherents of Greco-Egyptian cult interpreted it as an admonition to be silent about their initiation rites, about which no word should be spoken. Plut. Der Isket Os. 68, Ovid Met. 9.629. Horus Hypocrates is mentioned fairly frequently in epigraphic sources, Rhesis 770, 773-5. Like his parents, he was the recipient of votive offerings and sacrifices. He also received sacrifices in common with Isis, Serapis, and Osiris, in the spirit of family solidarity. In the Greco-Roman world, however, a separate place of worship was never built for Harpocrates. Sources do indicate that at least one temple structure was dedicated to him, in Amphipolis, Rhesis 1130905, but no archaeological traces have been found. It is likely that the dedication means that a chapel to Harpocrates was built within a sanctuary of Isis and Serapis. This would be consistent with other places of worship, e.g. in the Isaion at Pompeii, dedicated to his divine parents, in which many chapels and cult niches are detectable. Anubis. Jackal-headed Anubis is the god of mummification from the time of the Old Kingdom. In the desert he watched over the dead of the Anshtori Acropolis, the cemetery of Memphis, Klibel 2009, 278, 283. As a psychopomp, guide of the dead, he was an intermediary between this world and the next. He is the son of Seth and Nephthys, but accompanied his foster mother Isis in search of her missing husband Osiris, and later mummified his corpse. While Isis and Nephthys mourned the dead, Anubis performed the mouth-opening ritual on the corpse, which allowed the Ka, a part of the soul, to return to the dead body. In Egypt it was assumed that, without the soul, the dead could not live on in the afterlife. In the Egyptian cult of the dead, Anubis, or a priest of Anubis, was always in charge of embalming and mummification. Later, in the Greco-Egyptian cult of the gods, the mouth-opening ritual was still performed by priests to revive the cult statue. In the so-called Egyptian Osiris mysteries, in which the search for Osiris became a cultic performance, a masked priest played the role of Anubis. A depiction from Dendera shows a priest in such a costume, Dendera 4, Table 31, Quack 2003, 61. The jackal-headed appearance of Anubis was also adopted by the Greco-Egyptian cult of the gods. A priest masked as the jackal-headed Anubis is shown in various depictions of the Isis procession. The leading position of Anubis in the processions is also shown by his display in the calendar as a symbol for certain feast days. Herodotus refers to Anubis in connection with embalming rituals in Egypt, but does not mention his name or equate him with any Greek god. HDT 2.86.2.37. In the Greek world, however, there was a tradition of his identification with Hermes, who also functioned as a psychopomp. He was often called Hermanubis. In a divergence from the Egyptian myth as related by Plutarch, a Bithynian hymn, found in Chios, to Anubis from the 1st century CE calls him the son of Isis and Osiris Serapis, Series 325. Worship of Anubis outside Egypt is demonstrable only in the context of Greco-Egyptian cult. There were no shrines built especially for Anubis. Serapis. The old view that Serapis was a god artificially created by the Ptolemies is no longer tenable in light of present research. Hornborstel 1973, Mayer 2001. The thesis that the archetype of Serapis came from Sinope on the Black Sea coast, and stood as godfather for later representations of the deity, has also been proven to be wrong. The epithet Sinopean was erroneously derived by ancient authors from Sinope, and in fact refers to the area in Egyptian Memphis where there was a Serapeon. It is thus an indication of an Egyptian origin for Serapis, and Serapis should be understood as resulting from a pre-existing, evolving syncretism, probably beginning in pre-Ptolemaic times, and then promoted by Ptolemy Isota, 304-2832 BCE, see Mayer 2001. Serapis was a special manifestation of Osiris or the underworld god Osiopis, who came from Memphis and appeared there as a bull. Therefore, Serapis stood originally for the dead Apis bulls that became Osiris after they died. In Serapis, the Egyptian gods Osiris, Apis, Ptah of Memphis, Amun, and Ra were united in one form, thus he, like Osiris, was a god of the dead and of fertility. With the transfer of his cult to Alexandria around 320 BCE, Serapis was also worshipped as the king of the gods. His function was now to legitimize the rule of the Ptolemies, wholly in the tradition of the Theban Amun-Ra as god of the realm. Isis was placed at his side as his wife, and, together with Horus Hypocrates, they formed the Greco-Egyptian divine trinity. The Ptolemies also worshipped Serapis as the lord of eternity and time, seeing him as the arbiter of fate and as an oracle god, and giving him equal status with Zeus, Hades, Dionysos, and Asclepios. Serapis' appearance also supplies information about his Greco-Egyptian nature. Usually he sits on a throne, with a scepter in his left hand, a calatus or harvest basket as a crown, and three-headed Kerberos at his feet. These insignia of power identify him as king of the gods. The harvest basket is a fertility symbol marking him as the god of grain. Kerberos, the guardian of the underworld in Greek mythology, takes up the Egyptian origin of the god, Osiris as ruler of the underworld. But while the Hellenistic iconography of Serapis certainly refers to Egyptian thought, it shows no similarity with traditional ancient Egyptian representations of Osiris. Though in nature an Egyptian god, Serapis was completely Hellenized in outward form. Serapis is thus a god without a mythological history, an unusual condition in both Egyptian and Greek religion. His cult was important mainly for the Greek population of Egypt. The Egyptians themselves took little interest in him, especially in the rural areas of Egypt. Serapis remained the foreign god of the Greeks. Nevertheless, a socio-political commitment to integrate Egyptian and Greek traditions can certainly be recognized in the Ptolemies' development and promotion of the cult of Serapis. Greco-Egyptian cult. In the Greek world, Greco-Egyptian cult was first practiced in private. Elements from ancient Egyptian religion were integrated into the familiar repertoire of Greek religion, without greatly violating its nature. Such an adaptation of the unknown to the known is also reflected in the architecture of places of worship. Places of worship. The architecture of Greco-Egyptian sanctuaries was initially oriented to the Hellenistic architectural tradition, Gleb 2009, 48-130, drawing on an astonishing range of building types. Neither the temples nor the other elements of Greco-Egyptian sanctuaries were characterized by a unique architectural language. Nevertheless, there are some special features of Greco-Egyptian sanctuaries that distinguish them from those of Greek deities. They derive primarily from the example of ancient Egyptian temples. Thus, the sanctuaries of Greco-Egyptian gods, like most temples of Egyptian gods, were situated in urban contexts. In Hellenistic times, the sanctuaries were integrated into residential areas and had a partly private character. They came to be built in harbors, in commercial districts, or right in the centers of urban life, suggesting that their religious communities consisted mostly of merchants and sailors. The situation was different only in Egypt itself, where Greco-Egyptian cult was connected with the Ptolemaic dynasty. Not until the official recognition of the Greco-Egyptian gods outside Egypt did the cult gain adherents among other, native social classes, a development that, in Roman times, led eventually to its reconnection with the cult of the ruler. The orientation of Greco-Egyptian temples played no important role in cultic practice, only a very rough orientation of religious buildings to the south and east is observable. As in ancient Egyptian sanctuaries, the availability of a water source was more important, as demonstrated by the numerous waterworks installed in the Temenos sanctuaries, sing. Temenos. Like the Egyptian temples, almost all the sanctuaries had a sacred area completely shielded by a high wall from the outer, profane world. The effect of the sanctuary on its surroundings was limited to its front entrance. These sometimes powerful pylon-like structures were derived from either Egyptian models or the elaborate propylaea, gateways, of Greek architecture. Outwardly, most Greco-Egyptian sanctuaries were architecturally indistinguishable from the places of worship of other deities. Only an inscription placed over the entrance, a floor mosaic, or statues made reference to the gods worshipped in the Temenos. There were also pools at the entrance, from which water for the symbolic cleansing of believers was drawn before they entered the sanctuary. This was particularly characteristic of Greco-Egyptian religion. The temple and its courtyard dominated the inside of the sanctuary. Nearly all such facilities had courts or open spaces in which worshippers could assemble for the morning opening of the temple, sacrifices, and other rituals. These courts were built to many different designs, but were often shaped as wide peristyle courts, very like those of Egyptian temples. They also shared this aspect: one side of the temple was flanked by the Temenos wall or by the portico, so that the gaze of the community could be focused on it. On the other hand, almost all temples were pushed to the rear of the sanctuary, sometimes even beyond the surrounding Temenos wall, so that the courtyards occupied a far larger area than the temple. This arrangement stressed the importance of the meeting place and gave more space to the forecourt. The courts could serve as an auditorium from which events in the temple could be followed and the cult image seen. In the Greco-Egyptian cult of the gods, awareness of the threshold, a transition region, is of essential importance. For the adherent of the cult, all of life depended on this threshold. The court not only functioned as a meeting place for worshippers, but was also the space in which this intermediate state was ritually manifested. Thus, the courts were generally left open. If they were locked up, this was infrequently, and this is why there was a requirement for clearly marked religious boundaries, in order to manage the potential invasiveness of the profane. Also remarkable is the predominance, for religious reasons, of secondary buildings over somewhat smaller religious structures. With regard to decoration, the elaborate design of the courtyard area, the exterior of the temple, the side chapels, and meeting places is striking, while other spaces seem to have been rather neglected. This focus on the public area of the sanctuary, at the expense of other areas, probably simply reflects the usual location of the worshippers. The side rooms that they did not enter did not require elaborate decoration. The temples of Greco-Egyptian shrines were modeled on Greek building types modified only by local and temporal peculiarities. Therefore, the size of the temple varies enormously, between 13 square meters and 1,412 square meters. In Hellenistic times, the prevailing forms are the templum in Antes, the simplest type of temple, a rectangular structure with projecting side walls forming a porch before the main hall, and the naos, the inner chamber of a temple, with surrounding peristasis, a four-sided colonnade. The main temples had the function of protecting the cult image and housing religious objects and votive offerings. Large temples offered cult adherents the opportunity to participate in worship within the temple. All temples of the Greco-Egyptian gods show a clear focus on the front of the building. Porticos could be designed differently, but they all served as stages on which priests could carry out ritual acts before worshippers standing in the courtyard. These areas in front of all temples offered sufficient space for the placement of religious images and for the carrying out of ritual activities. Directly before the temple or in its pronaos, the inner area of the portico of the temple, resembling an entrance hall, there were benches for the assembled priests or other religious personnel. To the pronaos was connected the cella, the main inner chamber of the temple, which overlooked a broad entrance and could be closed off by shutting a door. The cult image was set up on a raised platform against its back wall. If the temple was orientated to the east or south, the image was illuminated by the sun when the temple was opened in the morning. In deep cella and large hall temples, special lighting effects could also be created by means of small windows, skylights, reflective flooring, water basins, or wall coverings, possibly made of glass. The door openings allowed the worshippers to look from the courtyard into the cella. Between 1,200 and 1,400 square meters in area, the cella was normally a rectangle with its narrow axis to the front, although some temples featured a rectangular cella presenting its long axis, a design probably intended to allow as many people as possible to see the inner sanctum from the courtyard. The different sizes of the cella reflect different temple functions. In temples with smaller cella, worshippers could not enter, but gathered in the yard in front of the sacred building. Half of the rituals were therefore carried out with the community excluded, while the other half took place in the forecourt of the temple. In religious buildings with a large cella, such as hall temples, worshippers could follow the rites inside the temple itself. Additional equipment and closets for cult images, for which it is more difficult to find evidence in the small cella, indicate the performance of special rituals. In some cella, water basins have been found below or in front of the cult image platform, as well as gutters, channels, and basins in the inner chamber. These allowed fluids from sacrificial victims and water used by temple servants for daily cleaning of the cult statues to run off directly, but they also formed visible barriers, marking the limits of contact with the cult image for the unauthorized. Stepped pools and tubs in the inner rooms of cella indicate the performance of ritual purifications, apparently associated with initiations. In the cavities of the bases of some cult images, objects have been found that suggest repositories for cult apparatus or reference libraries. In addition to utensils used for the daily cleaning and adornment of the cult image, these hollows held scrolls containing the most important liturgical texts and ritual prescriptions. In some temples there were also spaces within the base of the temple, in which, as in the subterranean crypts of Egyptian temples, cult objects were stored. The cult image stood at the back wall of the cella, elevated and orientated on the axis of the temple, so that the god looked towards the door and into the court beyond. The higher position of Greco-Egyptian cult images is analogous to the position of those in ancient Egyptian temples, where the floor level also rises continually up to the naos with its cult image. Thus, in both the Egyptian and Greco-Egyptian temple there is a rising, sacred topography, forecourt, cella, cult image. The connection between the area in front, a courtyard or a separate area within the cella, and the cult image in the temple interior allowed direct communication, previously unthinkable in Egypt, between simple worshippers and the divine in sanctuaries of Greco-Egyptian gods. This made the courtyard a richly equipped space for the community, with a fitting backdrop created by the combination of Hellenistic, Roman decoration with Egyptian and Egyptianizing elements. The designs and sacred symbols in the courtyard also served as religious instruction by establishing a connection to the cult practices and the myths of the Greco-Egyptian gods. Sanctuaries of Greco-Egyptian gods also always had side chapels, for the worship of gods associated with the chief deity of the temple. These were usually separate structures, but in the immediate vicinity of the main temple. If integrated into other rooms, they lay mostly near or directly behind the temple. If reduced to niches, they were inserted into the portico surrounding the courtyard. There were also chapels in the entrance area, which worshippers could visit before entering the main courtyard. At the back of a few temples could be found hearing ear chapels, known from the temples of Egypt, which allowed the ordinary worshipper to approach the deity directly. It is also possible that they were the site for the oracular consultations known from epigraphic sources, which could deal with religious, hierarchical, political, legal, and private matters. The water crypts discovered in some sanctuaries are specific to Greco-Egyptian cult. Their placement within the sacral topography was probably unimportant. What mattered was that they were of limited access and underground. In their function they resembled the Egyptian nilometer or pseudo-nilometer. In these water crypts, Nile water was stored for religious purposes, which included the daily cleansing of the temple as well as rites of initiation, in which the Nile water made possible a mystic identification with Osiris. Dining rooms and meeting halls can also be found in the sanctuaries. Some had benches that ran around the perimeter, which are also known from comparable spaces in late Egyptian temples. In their architecture these rooms do not differ from those of other Greek temples of the time, but their sometimes very elaborate cultic apparatus gives them a specific character. The design of the assembly rooms in the sanctuaries of Greco-Egyptian gods is fairly flexible, depending on the space, financial resources, and needs of particular communities. In sanctuaries without separate meeting rooms, courtyards, and porticos probably served as places of assembly. Rites and practices. Participation in Greco-Egyptian cult was connected, for its worshippers, with initiation into mysteries, Gleb 2009. 142-5, which marked a clear boundary for unbelievers. The architecture of many sanctuaries already differentiated the cult from the outer world, creating a clearly defined area and a sense of belonging to a community of faith. Accordingly, the courtyard of the sanctuary, and the rituals held within them, were accessible only to members and those who aspired to join them. One of these daily rituals was the morning opening of the temple, Gleb 2009, 131-3. Its sequence, like the ritual of the hours, was taken over from Egyptian religion. Before its performance, the priests washed in shallow water basins, corresponding to the cleansing pool of the priesthood in Egyptian sanctuaries. Then a priest awakened the cult image in the Holy of Holies of the temple. By means of the opening mouth ritual adopted from Egypt, the image of the god was transformed into a living, present deity. It was fed, washed, painted, dressed, and made part of a theatrical production. The hypostoloi or stolists assumed the duty of caring for the image, see Gleb 2009, 159. In order to be transported in rituals and processions, the statues were mostly smaller than life-size. Thus animated, the cult images made the gods accessible and touchable. After this ritual, special hymns were sung at the morning opening of the temple, in the court area, by priests and aratalagoi. Gleb 2009, 157-8. Fresh, Nile, water for libation vessels was drawn from water crypts, wells, or cisterns. At the main altar, which could be designed as a horn altar, and at numerous smaller altars, sacrifices were performed in sacrificial pits and areas. In Egypt, these rituals took place mostly in the temple, but here benches were set up in the court area and the porticos. The rites were accompanied by singers and musicians with sistrum, flute, trumpet, tympanum, harp, and bells. The sistrum is especially characteristic of cult of Greco-Egyptian gods, Gleb 2009, 148-50. Like the long flutes and the funnel-shaped trumpets, it was taken over from the cult of Atha, which also came from Egypt. In accordance with the Egyptian model, sacrifice was offered by a senior priest, assisted by pastaphoroi, auxiliary priests. Before some altars there were front steps that raised the priest and his activity above the religious community. In addition to the main altar, the raised pronaoi of some sacred buildings probably served as a religious stage for all the visible performances of sacrifice. The offerings consisted mainly of cereals, fruitcakes, dates, figs, pineapples, hen's eggs, a milk-honey mixture, water, geese, chickens, and, more rarely, cattle. The air was purified with incense and other aromatic material burned on the altars and in special censers, Gleb 2009, 150-1, along with resins, frankincense, and myrrh. The Egyptian kaifi, a highly prized incense, was also used. All these actions took place with the worshippers gathered in the courtyard. Their participation in the daily, monotonously repetitive rituals not only made the myth manifest, but also created a sense of communal belonging. Not all the rituals and ceremonies of Greco-Egyptian cult were connected with secret initiation into mysteries. Elaborate and spectacular processions also took place in public civic and harbor areas on the occasion of annual festivals, Gleb 2009, 139-42. These gave non-initiates a look at the unfamiliar cult, and allowed the community to recruit potential members. The calendar of Greco-Egyptian cult had several annual festivals: the New Year's Festival, the Inventio Osirides, or Isha, a festival that honored Isis' search for and discovery of Osiris, and the Navigium Isidis, navigation of Isis, Gleb 2009, 139-42. These celebrations were rooted in the temple festivals of the ancient Egyptian sanctuaries. The New Year's festival had forerunners in the festivals of Isis Sotis and of Soka Osiris, celebrated in Egypt in mid-July, on the day of the highest flooding of the Nile. The Inventio Osirides or Isha had its origin in the Egyptian mysteries of Osiris. During the celebrations, the Egyptian myth of Isis and Osiris was staged to commemorate the resurrection of the god. The Navigium Isidis festival, which opened the seafaring season in March, was celebrated for the first time in the Ptolemaic period in Canopus, near Alexandria, and involved the worship of Isis as patroness of sailing. Processions within and outside the sanctuaries were an integral part of all these festivals. Apuleius gives a detailed description of the Navigium Isidis. In the accompanying sacrifices, a vessel of Nile water, along with banners, was presented. In all cultic celebrations, great importance was given to dramas in which priests assumed the roles of gods, making the myth visible to the faithful. The large, lake-like pools in the courtyards are parallel to the holy lakes of Egyptian temples, served as performance spaces for such productions, in which the worshippers could identify with Osiris as well as with Isis. All festivities ended with a meal shared by the worshippers in the courtyard or one of the dining rooms. Cult participants. Mysteries and initiation. Before being accepted into the community, the adherent of Greco-Egyptian cult had to undergo an initiation into the dogma of the faith, the so-called mysteries. First, initiation into the Isis mysteries, then a second initiation, that of Osiris, which allowed the faithful to assume priestly duties. A fee was charged for both initiations. Gleb 2009, 142-5. Apuleius provides essential information on the Isis mysteries in the 11th book of his Metamorphoses, 2nd century CE, where he gives an idealized description of a sanctuary in Kinkri in Greece. Gleb 2009, 25-8. About its actual contents he is silent, as befits a secret. Before being initiated, the candidate was instructed in the religion, probably in the sanctuary itself, where depictions of teaching and indications of reference libraries have been found. The neophyte had to perform menial services in the temple before the initiation, Met. 1.1.2.1.1, to guard against impatience and disobedience, 1.1.2.1.6, and had to live abstemiously, renouncing unclean and sinful food, 1.1.2.1.9. Those who wished after the completion of life and on the threshold of being, to be, in a sense, reborn to a new existence, 1.1.2.1.7, were initiated. The instructions were carried out during the subsequent initiation in voluntary surrender to death and salvation by grace, 1.1.2.1.7. The goddess Isis announced the time and cost of the initiation ceremony in a dream. According to Apuleius, the community came to the shrine at night to present the neophyte with gifts of honor. The discovery of stores of lamps and torches confirms these nocturnal rituals. Dressed in new garments of white linen, the initiate was led by the priest into the Holy of Holies. Apuleius explains what happens next using imagery. I approached the border of death, trod the threshold of Proserpine, was carried back through all the elements. At midnight I saw the sun blazing with a white light. I approached the gods of the underworld and of heaven face to face, and worshipped them at close range. 1.1.23.7. The initiate had to pass symbolically through the 12 gates of the underworld, a ritual that refers to the underworld journey of the Egyptian god Ra. The religious rebirth of the initiate may have taken place in the Water Crypts, into which he descended at night, to begin, at daybreak, a new life consecrated to the god. On the morning after the initiation, the initiate, clothed in finely embroidered linen, was placed on a wooden platform before the cult image in the temple. A precious mantle hung on his shoulders, decorated with all kinds of fabulous creatures. Comparison with the Egyptian Book of the Dead leads to new understanding of the choice of motifs. When I was thus adorned like the sun and set up like a statue, the veils suddenly parted, and the people pressed in to see me. 1.1.24.4. The day was celebrated with a meal and festivities. Candidates could be initiated into the Osiris mysteries only once a year. Apuleius describes it, but only in hints, as it were. Living later in Rome, Lucius is invited in a dream to a second initiation. 1 year after his first one, he was not yet illumined by the rites of the great god and the greatest father of the gods, unconquered Osiris. For although these deities and faiths were connected, indeed united, there was nonetheless a great difference in the initiation. 11.27.2 ff. In the dream an initiate appears to him, who lays thursoi, ivy fronds, and other secret attributes before his house altar and announces a solemn meal. According to Apuleius, these festivities were connected with great financial expenditure. After a period of abstinence and the shaving of the head, I was illumined by the nocturnal rites of the first among the gods and applied myself with full devotion to the holy worship of the kindred religion. 1.1.28.5. Religious communities. Some believers of the communities came together to form internal groups. Gleb 2009, 162-6. These cliques, Melanephoroi, Therapeutai, Isiastai, Serapiastai, Anubiastai, Osiriastai, and so on functioned primarily as religious communities, but there were also groups with largely social and economic purposes. They met for meals to honor the gods in the meeting places and dining rooms of the sanctuary, and discussed community concerns, such as the construction and maintenance of the facility. As an example, we may cite the sanctuary in Ostia, which has extensive dining and meeting rooms, Gleb 2009, Cat. 28 Ostia 272-6. In the courtyard of the sanctuary there were thesauroi containing various votive offerings, small altars, divine images, statues of the donor, statuettes, or votive tablets given by individuals or groups. The collective feeling arising from dedicating statues, sharing meals, and so on, had both religious and socio-political dimensions. Cult personnel. Greco-Egyptian cult personnel were organized hierarchically: priests, pastaphoroi, assistant priests, and other functionaries, Gleb 2009, 157-61. Originally, the priests were still Egyptian-born, passing their knowledge down to their sons, who would take up the office, e.g. on Delos, Rhysis 2020101. In late Hellenistic times there could also be non-Egyptian priests, as long as they fulfilled certain requirements. To be ordained, candidates had to complete a multi-stage initiation ritual adopted from Egypt. The more highly placed functionaries of Greco-Egyptian cult had shaved heads and clean-shaven faces, like Egyptian priests. They were clothed with a robe knotted over the chest, a fringed shawl, and shoes probably made from palm or papyrus fibers, according to ancient Egyptian tradition. The task of the priests was to perform the liturgies and rites in a traditional manner. In some sanctuaries, the priests were supported by prophets, who also understood the sacred teachings, but had to manage the finances of the sanctuary. The pastaphoroi, however, were recruited from the indigenous population from the beginning, but had to undergo an initiation like that of the priests to qualify for their office. The main task of the pastaphoroi was to carry the cult image, hence their designation as shrine porters. They also had the duty of keeping the cult apparatus and the privilege of being able to enter the cellar of the temple. Under the pastaphoroi in rank stood the hypostoloi, also known as stolists or hierostolists. They served the cult image, washing, anointing, and dressing the statue, as in ancient Egyptian ritual. This office was drawn from the indigenous population and was one of the few in Greco-Egyptian cult that could be assumed by women. From the Metamorphoses of Apuleius we know that a grammatius, a sort of secretary, invited the pastaphoroi to a gathering after the new year. In the mural in the portico of the Assium at Pompeii, the scribe wears a feather on his temple, probably a reminder that a hawk brought the priests of Thebes a scroll wrapped with a red ribbon containing the rules of the cult. Hence, it is assumed that the scribes were generally Egyptians, a supposition confirmed by an inscription from Aquileia in which a male hierogrammatius is called Arnuphis of Egypt. Oneirocritai, dream interpreters, are mentioned in inscriptions from Athens, Serapis C. on Delos, and Ptolemy. They evaluated the dreams of cult members and initiates, and also determined the timing of initiation, as with Lucius in the Metamorphoses of Apuleius. Aratalagoi, orators, were the priests who sang the hymns in the rituals. They are known from Athens, from Serapis C. on Delos, and later from Rome. Neokoroi, temple guards, and Zacharoi, temple workers, certainly represented the lowest-ranking staff in the sanctuaries, but their tasks were still important. They stood in the sacred area, monitored access to the sanctuary, and maintained order. Initially chosen to hold office only for a year, they could later be appointed for several consecutive years. Conclusion. The adherents of Greco-Egyptian cult entered, as it were, a parallel world. Shrine porters, priests, scribes, initiates, and simple believers all played their part in staging an effect of absolute power. Within the sanctuary was manifested a force more potent than the commonly known gods. Greco-Egyptian cult promised a righteous life without class differences and gave believers hope of existence after death. How attractive and captivating Greco-Egyptian cult was, even in its decline, is shown by a text from the 4th century CE, which, on the one hand, is written in the style of the ancient Egyptian Isis Aratalages and thus reveals an unbroken tradition, but, on the other, apostrophizes a present, current, and all-embracing deity. What Apuleius presents as a harmless story with touches of burlesque, the transformation of an ass into a man, can be recognized in its full force in this Christian spell, London Magical Papyrus No. 46. I am the truth, full of revulsion against the misdeeds in the world. I am what makes lightning, here magical words are inserted, and thunder. I am he whose sweat falls as a rain on the earth to fertilize it. I am he whose mouth is utterly in flames. I am what produces and reproduces. I am the grace of the world's age. Suggested reading. On the cult in general, see Vidman 1970, Witt 1971, Saunson 1979, Greco 2013. Cartography, Greco 2001. Archaeology, Kleibel 2009. Iconography, Individual Gods in LIMC. Literary sources, Griffiths 1970 and 1975, Burton 1972, Merkelbach 1995. Epigraphical sources, Vidman 1969, Totti 1985, Greco 2005, Addenda in Greco and Vermeers 2008. Numismatics, Greco 2008. Chapter 42. Bactria and India. Rachel Mayers. It would seem that the Greek gods in India, though they remained as official coin types or material for artists, had little enough to do with the religion of the people. It cannot be said how far Heracles and Dionysus were merely Krishna and Siva, and certainly Zeus was almost always the elephant god of Kapisa. Tarn 1951, 1938, 392. Introduction. 80 The time of the publication of Tarn's monumental The Greeks in Bactria and India in 1938 there was little or no archaeological or epigraphic evidence for the religious practices of the inhabitants of the Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek kingdoms. This situation has changed dramatically. Most of the sites and monuments discussed in this chapter began to be excavated only in the mid to late 20th century, and some unprovenanced finds, especially of inscriptions, were first published only in the 2000s. However, Tarn's hunch that the Greek gods of the easternmost Hellenistic states may have been known under different names by different constituencies has, if anything, been confirmed. The Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek states are not well documented in the extant historical sources. The majority of their kings are known only from their coins. For discussion see Holt 2012, and for examples, the catalogues Bopiaraki 1991 and 1998. Establishing a firm chronology is therefore difficult. A few significant dates may, however, be borne in mind. In the 320s BCE, Alexander campaigned through Bactria and northwestern India, and established a number of garrison settlements populated by Greek and Macedonian soldiers. In a treaty of 303 BCE, the lands south of the Hindu Kush, Arachosia and northwest India, were ceded by Seleucus I to the Indian Emperor Chandragupta Maurya. The remaining Greek settlements north of the Hindu Kush, in Bactria, remained nominally part of the Seleucid Empire until the mid-3rd century BCE, when they became independent under a local Greek dynasty, the Diadotids. By the turn of the 3rd-2nd century BCE, the Greek kings of Bactria who succeeded the Diadotids were powerful enough to undertake military campaigns into Arachosia and India, recapturing many of the territories lost in the Treaty of 303. Around the 140s BCE, Bactria itself was lost to a fatal combination of nomadic incursions, war with Parthia, and internal dynastic strife. However, the politically fragmented Indo-Greek states survived, some perhaps as late as the turn of the Common Era. Against the inclusion of a chapter on the Hellenistic kingdoms of Bactria and India in a work on Greek religion, it might be objected that both the Greekness of the inhabitants of these kingdoms, and the Greekness of their religions are questionable. The former point can essentially be dismissed. The descendants of Alexander's settlers, who maintained, to some extent, Greek language and customs in the East, considered themselves to be Greek, and were described as such by their neighbors. For example, a Greek ambassador to the court of an Indian king will be introduced in the section Arachosia and India, below. The Greekness of Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek religion is, however, more difficult to defend. The religious practices of people who asserted, in public discourse, and especially political imagery, a connection with Greeks and Greece were diverse. Greek gods were depicted on coins and temple images, but whether in the use of Near Eastern temple designs or in the dedication of Buddhist relics, Greek cults were only part of the religious constellation of the region. In the following discussion, I aim to approach the religious practices of the Greek or Greek-dominated communities of the Hellenistic Far East with as few ethnocultural assumptions as possible. My emphasis will be on the multiplicity of cult practices at religious sites, the various names and meanings that might be attached to the same images and practices by different constituencies, and the political purposes for which religious imagery might be employed. This material illustrates the diversity of what we might think of as Greek religious practice, and also the degree of innovation and evolution that might take place, especially in zones of contact with other cultures and religious traditions. The archaeological and epigraphic evidence. Bactria. Most of our evidence for religious practice in the Greco-Bactrian kingdom derives from eastern Bactria, modern northeastern Afghanistan and southern Tajikistan, because this is the region in which the greatest number of sites of the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE have been excavated. The material from and literature on these sites is reviewed in May's 2011. The capital, at Bactra, modern Bork, near Mazar-i-Sharif, has not yet been thoroughly excavated. The two most important sites for our purposes are Ori-Khanum and Tarkt-i-Sanjin, both of which were settlements situated at junctions of tributaries with the river Oxus. At Ori-Khanum, a city which was occupied from the late 4th early 3rd century BCE to the 140s BCE, we have two excavated temples, May's 2011-2013. The city's main temple, set within a walled sanctuary where evidence of ritual practice includes small limestone altars and vases for phonic libations, was built on a Near Eastern architectural model, with a distinctive stepped niche decoration on its outer walls. What is preserved of the main cult statue, on the other hand, is Greek in style. The thunderbolt motif on the statue's sandal suggests that it represented a Zeus, perhaps syncretized with a local god, Grenet 1991. The second temple at Ori-Khanum lay just outside the city walls and had the same niche decoration as the intramural temple. Nothing has been preserved of its ritual equipment or divine images. Ori-Khanum had other loci of cult activity, outside the formal temples. On the city's natural Acropolis, a small open-air altar, set on a stepped podium, was oriented for offering towards the rising sun, a practice which has been linked to similar Iranian rites. Boris and Grenet 1991, 181-3, who also discuss possible local comparanda. The gymnasium contained a Greek dedicatory inscription to Hermes and Heracles. The shrine of the city's founder, Kineas, contained a lengthy Greek inscription, only a fragment of which is preserved, of Delphic maxims, which states that it was set up in Kineas Temenos, Rougemont 2012, numbers 97-8. Robert 1968 is the editio princeps of both the gymnasium and shrine of Kineas inscriptions. Some of the city's dead were interred in mausolea outside the city walls, with Greek inscriptions and sculptural decoration. Most of these inscriptions are very brief, confined to the deceased's name, but two longer, although again very fragmentary, texts have recently been published by Rougemont, 2012, numbers 136-7. A fragmentary Greek epitaph from another Bactrian site, Gigatepe, close to Dilbagin, see below, belonged to a man named Diogenes and makes reference to Hades, Rougemont 2012, number 91. The Temple of the Oxus at Tarkt-i-Sanjin, downstream from Ori-Khanum on the Tajik bank of the river, around 100 kilometers as the crow flies, has yielded a much larger range of cult equipment than the Ori-Khanum temples, although analysis of the cult practice there remains problematic. See Litvinsky and Pia. Ikjan 2002 for an introduction to the site. There is a good, concise summary of the principal points of debate about the function and identification of the temple in Grenet 2005. Comparatively little has been excavated of the surrounding settlement. The temple itself stood within a fortified sanctuary. Subsidiary corridors within the main temple building have yielded large numbers of dedicatory offerings. The deified river Oxus was the principal cult object. We find a dedication to the river, in Greek, on a small altar bearing a statuette of a satyr playing a double flute, votive, dedicated by Atrisox, to the Oxus, Rougemont 2012, number 95. More items from the site bearing brief Oxus dedications have recently come to light, testifying to continuity in cult practice during and after the fall of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom in the mid-2nd century BCE, Rougemont 2012, numbers 95-6, Drujanina and Lindstrom 2013. Theophoric Oxus names were especially popular in the region at all periods for which we have documentation. Among the offerings in the temple caches, we find a large number of weapons, ivories, some of them in Greek style, or of Greek subjects, such as Heracles, gold plaques portraying worshippers, and items depicting mythical creatures, including an appropriately aquatically themed hippocampus, Litvinsky and Pia. Icjan 1995. There is considerable controversy over whether, in addition, the temple of the Oxus might be identified as a Zoroastrian fire temple. See the discussion of Boyce and Grenet 1991, 173-9, Bernard 1994, and the note on the topic in Grenet 2005. Two small chambers filled with ashes and altars were excavated in the wings of the main temple building, which led to this suggestion by the excavators. The matter remains open for debate, but, as with the temples at Oikonum, I would emphasize the diversity of the forms of cult activity that took place within this single space, and the multiplicity of interpretations that may have been attached to the cult. Even the most overtly Greek images and practices may have been read in different ways by different constituencies. Two more Bactrian examples bear this out. A Greek inscription found in the region of Kuliab, in southern Tajikistan, contains the dedication of a man named Heliodotos to Hestia, in a grove, Alsos, of Zeus, for the sake of King Euthydemus, reigned c. 230, 200 BCE, and his son Demetrios. The stone is unprovenanced, so we know nothing of the cult place that, in Greek, is termed the Grove of Zeus. We do not know whether there was a temple building, and statues of the gods, or, if there were, what they looked like. Nor do we know the forms of cult practice took place there, nor, perhaps most importantly, whether the Zeus and Hestia of Heliodotos inscription were known by different names by different worshippers. Another Bactrian site where superficially Greek signals permit different readings is Dilbagin, a town in the Bactra oasis, and its temple of the Dioskoroi. See Kruglikova 1977, although it should be noted that the chronology of the site has been much debated. Although both town and temple may have existed in the Greco-Bactrian period, the excavated remains date, for the most part, to the Kushan period, the early centuries CE. It nevertheless provides useful testimony to the durability of Greek divine imagery, although perhaps not religion, 2 centuries or more after the fall of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. A wall painting in the temple's vestibule depicts the Dioskoroi, standing next to their horses, holding their bridles, and wearing their characteristic pylos caps. The iconography is recognizably Greek, but it is unaccompanied by any textual indication of the names by which these figures were known. It is possible that the images of the Dioskoroi, and an Athena on a wall painting from the same temple, were inherited from their appearance on Greco-Bactrian coinage, Kruglikova 1977, 409, 421, Grenet 1987a, on Greco-Bactrian coins as the source for later religious iconography, see Boyce and Grenet 1991, 161. I shall return to the topic of divine images on Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek coins in religious iconography, below. Like coins, engraved gems depicting classical figures, even with legends in Greek, were small, portable, and of sufficient intrinsic value to ensure that they might be passed from hand to hand over long distances and time periods. For example, a ring from Tomb 2 at Tiliatip, a collection of nomadic tombs in Bactria, dating to the 1st century BCE, contains a gem depicting Athena, captioned in Greek, in a gold setting, Hebert and Cambon 2011, 242, number 55. Arachosia and India. The evidence for religious practice in the Greek communities and states of Arachosia and India is more heavily weighted towards the epigraphic than the archaeological. Although archaeological investigations were carried out at the site of Old Kandahar, ancient Alexandria in Arachosia, in the 1970s, the city remains little known. However, the small number of inscriptions discovered at the site give a disproportionately rich level of insight into both the local religious practices of its inhabitants and attempts by an Indian emperor to introduce them to the teachings of Buddhism. I will introduce the evidence for Buddhism at Old Kandahar below in Buddhism, and restrict my remarks here to two other Greek inscriptions, belonging to a man whose father's name was Aristonax, early 3rd century BCE, and to Sarphitos son of Neratos, 2nd century BCE. The changing political status of Alexandria in Arachosia throughout this period, from Persian control to conquest by Alexander, to province of the Mauryan Empire, to Greco-Bactrian control, should be borne in mind. The short, badly damaged dedication by the son of Aristonax states that it has been set up in this sanctuary, Temenos, in thanks for his salvation, but the rest of the preserved text permits widely varying reconstructions. Fraser 1979, Rougemont 2012, number 81. It may contain a reference to the city's eponymous, founder, Alexander, only the portion Alex-, however, is preserved. The dedicator's salvation may have been from a wild animal attack, the Roz. The autobiographical epitaph of Sarphitos son of Neratos was acquired on the antiquities market, but its provenance is considered to be Old Kandahar, Bernard, Pinault, and Rougemont 2004, Rougemont 2012, number 84. Its author, whose name is not Greek, but may be Indian, describes his education, career, and restoration of his family's wealth and honor in elegant Greek verse, peppered with allusions to the fates and his cultivation of the virtue of the archer, Apollo, and the Muses, Mayes 2012. His name and patronymic are spelled out in an acrostic. Whether or not the content of the inscription can tell us anything about the religious practices of Sarphitos and his community, we can see that the names of Greek gods and supernatural entities, and knowledge of the matters of which they served as patrons, were in currency in 2nd century Kandahar, even among those who did not have Greek names. I deliberately leave the question of Sarphitos' ethnic identity as opposed to name or descent open. It is in the Indo-Greek states that we find the most decisive evidence, textual and artistic, for Greek adoption of local religions. Although Greek divinities continue to be depicted on coins, as I shall discuss in religious iconography on Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek coins, below, Indian gods, iconography, and languages also appear. The city of Taxila, near modern Islamabad, like Ai-Khanoum, had temples whose architecture and religion owed more to local ways than to Greek. Outside the Indo-Greek domains, at the city of Vidisha, modern Besnagar, Madhya Pradesh, we find a Taxilon Greek patronizing a local Indian cult center. The Indo-Greek period settlement at Taxila, Serapis, was one of several cities founded in the vicinity at different periods. Although the city of Serapis was founded in the period of the Greco-Bactrian expansion into India, in the early to mid-2nd century BCE, its excavated strata are, for the most part, much later, dating to the period after the fall of the Indo-Greek kingdoms. On the excavation of Taxila, see Marshall 1960. Caution should therefore be exercised in interpreting the remains of the city's religious institutions and deciding whether they had the same form under the Indo-Greeks. Apollonios of Tyana visited Taxila in the 1st century CE, and a brief account of the city is given in Philostratos' life, which includes a description of a large, column stone temple containing a small shrine, 2.20. There are two candidates for the identification of this temple, Jandile C., some distance to the north of the walls of Serapis, and Mora Maliaran, to the west of the city, Rapine 1995. Although Philostratos claims that the temple contained wall scenes depicting Alexander the Great and Porus, he does not name a cult object. Both temples are more overtly classical in style than any of the Ai-Khanoum temples, with columns and peristyles, Mora Maliaran, or windowed circumambulatory corridors, Jandile C., but little or nothing remains of their religious equipment. The question of whether they were dedicated to a Greek, Iranian, or Indian deity, and the form of worship, therefore remains essentially open. Within the city of Serapis itself we find further religious institutions. Here, the connection to Indian religions is clearer. There are two Buddhist stupas, mound-like structures containing relics, one of which, the double-headed eagle stupa, bears pilasters in Greek style with Corinthian columns. The city's largest cult site was the apsidal temple, but this was destroyed by an earthquake in around 30 CE, and a Buddhist shrine rebuilt in its courtyard. Whether or not the temple was originally Buddhist in denomination, it was therefore appropriated by what had become the dominant religion of the region. A Taxilon Greek named Heliodoros, who served as ambassador from the Indo-Greek king Antiochus, reigned c.115-95 BCE, left an inscription, in Prakrit, on a pillar at Besnagar, the capital of a local Indian king named Bhagabhadra, in which he described himself as a devotee of the god Va with Dionysus Sudeva, a patronymic indicating Krishna, an avatar of Vishnu, trans. Salomon 1998, 265-7, see further May's forthcoming. Many questions arise from this inscription. Does Heliodoros dedicate out of personal piety, or because erecting a pillar outside the temple at Besnagar was the done thing for an ambassador seeking to make a positive impression on the local ruler? If a devotee of Vishnu, had he begun to worship the god during his posting at Besnagar, or in his home city of Taxila? Would Heliodoros have understood the Vishnu of his inscription at Besnagar as another god, perhaps a Greek-named god in another city or context? As I have already suggested, the superficially ethnocentric names of gods, temples, and cults that we find in our sources from the Hellenistic Far East may, in fact, permit multiple readings, in both contemporary discourse and modern analysis. Religion and politics. Buddhism. I have already discussed two Greek inscriptions from the site of Old Kandahar, ancient Alexandria in Arachosia, which tell us something of the religious life and cultural milieu of the Greek literate community there. A further group of inscriptions reflect an attempt at proselytization. The Indian Emperor Chandragupta Maurya had received Arachosia in 303 BCE. In the 260s BCE, his grandson, Aa with ring above ochre, embraced Buddhism, and set up a series of edicts, on pillars and rock faces throughout his empire, proclaiming his own conversion and promoting the Buddhist Dhamma, law. Several such inscriptions have been found at Kandahar, and instead of being in Prakrit, they are in Greek and Aramaic. A comparatively lengthy Greek inscription, although not all of it is preserved, represents a translation of Aa with ring above ochre's 12th and 13th major rock edicts, Rougemont 2012, number 83. A shorter, bilingual Greek-Aramaic inscription is a freer translation of the format and sentiments of other edicts, Rougemont 2012, number 82. As well as recording his desire that the peoples of his empire should adopt pious virtues such as vegetarianism and respect for their elders, Aa with ring above ochre also indicates that he has tried to spread the Dhamma beyond his borders. The Kandahar translation does not preserve the full text of the 13th major rock edict, but more complete texts elsewhere contain the following passage. Now it is conquest by Dhamma that beloved of the gods considers to be the best conquest. And it, conquest by Dhamma, has been won here, on the borders, even 600 yojanas away, where the Greek king Antiochus rules, beyond there where the four kings named Ptolemy, Antigonos, Magas and Alexander rule, likewise in the south among the Cholas, the Pandyas, and as far as Tamarpani. Here in the king's domain among the Greeks, the Kambojas, the Nabakas, the Napapamkits, the Bojas, the Patinikas, the Andras, and the Paladas, everywhere people are following beloved of the gods' instructions in Dhamma. Even where beloved of the gods' envoys have not been, these people too, having heard of the practice of Dhamma and the ordinances and instructions in Dhamma given by beloved of the gods, are following it and will continue to do so. This conquest has been won everywhere, and it gives great joy, the joy which only conquest by Dhamma can give. But even this joy is of little consequence. Beloved of the gods considers the great fruit to be experienced in the next world to be more important. Dhammika 1993, 26-8. The 13th major rock edict indicates Asoka's desire and efforts to proselytize Greeks both inside and outside his empire, but we know little about the reception of these attempts at conversion, certainly not among the Hellenistic monarchs to the west whose names he knew and with whom he was most probably in some form of diplomatic contact. Evidence exists, however, to document the success of Buddhism in later periods, among later Indo-Greek monarchs and their people. I have already noted the presence of Buddhist stupas at Taxila, in a region which was later a great center of Buddhism. Brancaccio and Berendt 2006, Bactria, too, was an important center of Buddhism in periods long after the fall of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, c.e.g. Litvinsky and Zejmal 2004. As I shall go on to discuss in religious iconography on Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek coins, below, Buddhist imagery appears on the coins of some Indo-Greek kings. But one particular Indo-Greek king, Menander, reigned c. 155 to 130 BCE in northern India, not only appears to have adopted Buddhism himself, but, as King Milinda, enjoyed a legendary status in Indian tradition as a convert to and patron of the religion. Menander is one of the very few Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek kings to be mentioned in classical sources, which, however, celebrate his military prowess more than his religious leanings. Strabo, 1.1.1.1, records that he advanced far into northern India, and was one of a series of local Greek kings who, between them, conquered more territory in India than Alexander the Great. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, 47, states that coins of Menander are still to be found in the present day, 1st century CE, in the northwestern Indian port of Barigaza. During Menander's reign, Buddhism certainly flourished in northwestern India. A Buddhist reliquary from Bhaja, in Gandhara, bears a regnal year of Menander, Majumdar 1937. But the most remarkable account of Menander and his reign is a much later Pali Buddhist text, the Milindapanya, or Questions of King Milinda, Rhys Davids 1890, on Menander, see also Bopyarachai 1990a, 1990b, Fossman 1993. In this dialogue, Menander, who is described as a Greek king, is depicted in debate with a Buddhist sage, Nagasena, and is eventually won over to Buddhism. The account is, on the whole, given its priorities, light on historical detail. What it does indicate is that, according to later tradition at any rate, Menander was favorable towards Buddhism and most likely an adherent himself. Religious iconography on Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek coins. Like their colleagues in the other Hellenistic monarchies, some, at least, of the Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek kings received divine honors. Antimachos was deified during his reign, as attested in the dating formula of a Greek tax receipt from Bactria, Clarice and Thompson 2007, on royal cult in Bactria, see further Martinez Sev 2010, 13-18. They also acted as patrons of religious cults. Both the temple with indented niches at Ori Khanum and the temple of the Oxus contained clay sculptures with diadems. The coinage of the Greco-Bactrian kings displays a range of Greek deities. See, concisely, the discussion of Martinez Sev 2010, 2-6, a browse through the catalogues Bopyarachai 1991, 1993, or 1998 will give an idea of the range of deities depicted on both Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek coins. Zeus was favored by the Diodotids on their silver coinage, the eponymous thundering Zeus of Holt 1999, with the pairs of Hermes and Athena, and Zeus and Artemis on the bronze coinage of Diodotos too. Euthydemus introduced a type of Heracles, used also by his son Demetrios I, and Eucratides employed the Dioscoroi. As I have already noted, the creators of paintings and statues in later temples, such as the Temple of the Dioscoroi at Dibyrgen, could have drawn inspiration from such images on coins. As Martinez Sev notes, all such depictions of apparently Greek gods could have carried a double meaning, intentional or unintentional. Artemis, for example, could have been understood as the Near Eastern goddesses Anahita or Nana, or a local Bactrian equivalent, Martinez Sev 2010, 5-7. Following the conquests of the early 2nd century BCE, Indo-Greek kings such as Agathocles and Pantaleon also began to strike hybrid Indo-Greek coins with bilingual legends, and to adopt Indian religious imagery in addition to Greek. Agathocles introduced images of the gods Samkashana and Va with Diaresis Sudeva Krishna. The Taxilon Greek Heliodorus' later dedication to Va with Diaresis Sudeva at Besnagar should be recalled. Heliodorus' own king, Antialcidas, stuck more closely to the Greek iconographic tradition, even on bilingual coins. He employed types of a throned Zeus, Zeus with an elephant, caps of the Dioscoroi with palms, and an elephant alone. The famed Buddhist convert Menander favored a greater variety of symbols. He issued types of Athena and Nike, Heracles, an elephant, a bull's head, a camel, a tripod, a palm, and a boar's head, but the type which has attracted the greatest attention is that bearing the image of a wheel, identified with the Buddhist wheel of law. The political context of all of these choices of image, language, and design must be borne in mind, as well as being prompted by the personal piety of these individuals. Where relevant, their use of images to appeal to particular communities and constituencies was carefully managed. Greek gods in the Kushan Empire. The numismatic and epigraphic record from the Kushan Empire, which rose to dominance in the former Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek domains in the early 1st century CE, provides indirect evidence that the earlier Greek gods of the region in fact had multiple identities. The Greek gods of the Hellenistic Far East were, or became, something more complex than that. The coins of Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek kings, as I have discussed, bear many divine images with familiar classical iconography. Even the most quintessentially Greek of these images from a foreign pantheon may well have been susceptible to alternate readings by the local peoples of Central Asia and India. Boris and Grenet 1991, 161. Images of Helios, for example, with his sunburst crown, and driving a chariot, appear on the coins of the Greco-Bactrian king Plato. For examples, see Bopiaraki 1991, pl. 24, Boyce and Grenet 1991, 162-3, already see an evolution in the imagery of Helios on these coins towards that more typical of the Indian god Surya, or Iranian Mithra. Helios is also depicted, in bust form, on cult objects from both Ari Khanum and Takhtai Sanjin, noted by Schenker 2012, 140. The objects in question are a plaque depicting Kybele from the temple with indented niches at Ari Khanum, Frankfurt 1984, 93-104, and a silver plaque from the Temple of the Oxus, Litvinsky 2010. On other coins of Plato, Helios is depicted standing and holding a scepter, again with his distinctive sun rays. This image survives onto the coinage of the Kushan Emperor Kanishk in the early 2nd century CE, where it undergoes a reinterpretation. Kanishk implemented a policy of replacing Greek legends on his coins with text in the Bactrian language, and at the same time of translating captions which identified gods by their Greek names into the names of local Iranian gods. Crib 2007, 366-7. The god recognizable from Plato's coins, and captioned on Kanishk's early issues, as Helios, becomes Mithra without any further change in iconography. This translation of Greek into Iranian gods was only the culmination of a long process of syncretism, which had begun under Greco-Bactrian rule. Multiple such assimilations might be possible for any individual Greek god. In addition to Helios, in his solar aspect, Mithra might also be equated with Zeus. Martinez Sev 2010, 8-9. Conclusions. As well as the cults of Greek gods, other religions flourished in the Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek kingdoms. In Bactria, the river Oxus was worshipped, and the archaeological evidence is also suggestive of the existence of other local and Near Eastern cults, both within the precincts of shrines such as the Ari Khanum temples and the Temple of the Oxus, and in independent locations. In India, we find evidence of the importance of Buddhism and the cults of Indian gods both to the region's inhabitants, Greek and non-Greek, and in political display. There was considerable flexibility in iconography and religious practice in the Hellenistic Far East. Sites might serve as foci of multiple religious rites, perhaps with different ethnic slants, and be patronized by more than one ethnic group, or by individuals with a more complex personal ethnic identity. The use of multiple names for the same temple or divine image need not necessarily have operated at the level of officially orchestrated or approved syncretism. But if this did occur, as I suspect it did, it may have allowed diverse ethnic communities to use the same site without the necessity of appropriating the deity and its worship for any particular ethnic affiliation. This is not to impute any degree of split personality to the identity and iconography of the divinity. Greeks may have looked at the Dioskoroi at Dilbertsin and seen one thing, and local Bactrians may have looked at them and seen another. How would a Greek and a Bactrian have referred to them in conversation with one another? On the other hand, it is possible that people who looked at such an image did so with a conscious awareness that it was more all-encompassing, something that could have the attributes of one god without denying its identity as the other. Suggested reading. The classic accounts of the history of the Greek kingdoms of Bactria and India are Tarn 1951, 1938, and Nerain 1957, but both are now essentially only of historiographical interest. For references to the archaeological literature on the sites discussed in this chapter, see Mayes 2011, regularly updated at www.bactria.org. The collections of articles edited by Bernard and Grenet 1991 and Grenet 1987b contain debates, inter alia, on the identification of cult statues and of practices associated with Zoroastrianism. On Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek numismatics, good starting points are Holt 1999 and the Catalogue Bopiaraki 1991. Chapter 43. China and Greece, Comparisons and Insights. Lisa Raffles. Introduction. This brief account of Chinese and Greek religion focuses on three topics that are not only of significant interest to both subjects, but also lend themselves to comparison: cosmogony, cosmology, and gods and humans and mantic practices, divination. I begin with several points of methodology and the problem of how to structure a comparison, and then discuss why a comparison between Chinese and Greek religion is rewarding. Any comparison must take into account substantial differences in both sources and theoretical accounts. Chinese sources vastly outnumber the Greek. This situation offers the opportunity of using the Chinese evidence to address some lacunae in the Greek record. The range of Chinese evidence offers a view of important changes and debates within as well as between cultural traditions. Attention to internal changes and debates is important in order to avoid overgeneralization. Several differences between the Chinese and Greek evidence are noteworthy. The Chinese evidence offers the advantage of historical continuity, which has little or no Greek counterpart. For example, despite the political upheavals of 20th century China, mantic activities remain widely practiced in Greater China. By mantic activities I mean divination, fortune-telling, the use of the I Ching image, classic of change. The Chinese evidence thus offers the prospect of both historical and ethnographic materials within one tradition. In both these areas, present research has only begun to sketch the possibilities. The Chinese evidence thus offers multiple opportunities to defamiliarize or parochialize well-known Greek perspectives. Several methodological perspectives are important. The first is the need to focus on both intellectual and social institutions. This point was articulated in a landmark volume in which Jean-Pierre Vernant, 1974, addressed the rationality and coherence of divination and its significance in the formation of social institutions. Recognition of the importance of the social role of divination in turn prompted other questions, for example, the authority of divination within a society and the place of mantic specialists in social hierarchies. Vernant also emphasized the normalcy of both aspects of divination in civilizations where it was central. A second methodological point is the importance of anthropology and the use of comparables across cultures, in the sense of Detienne 2000 and 2001. To posit comparables, we must consider historically specific and concrete comparanda within each culture within its indigenous historical context. Only then can we look between contexts. For social practices, we must compare concrete particulars embedded in their social contexts and institutions. For ideas, we must draw on histories of change and debate within each context. Cultural comparison, undertaken in concrete situations and on questions subjected to debate in each particular context, can bring new and unexpected insights to help us better understand concepts and practices that, because of their universality, can easily lead us to partial and reducing generalizations. Yet not all aspects of Chinese and Greek religion are equally comparable. One problem is how we understand and compare genres. In areas like medicine or historiography, textual genres and interpretive problems are readily comparable, but in others they are not, for example, in the very different Chinese and Greek histories of astronomy, astrology, and mythology. A third point is the issue of diversity and contestation within ancient Greek and early Chinese religions. Neither can be taken as a timeless, essential whole. But once we historicize either, the ground begins to change under our feet, and comfortable terms cease to hold purchase. The theoretical histories of Chinese and Greek religion have very different strengths. The long history of engagement between Greco-Roman classics and anthropology, and especially the contributions of Moses Finley, 1953, 1954, 1973, Jean-Pierre Vernant, Marcel Detienne, 2000, 2001, and others to establish comparative methods in these disciplines have created theoretical perspectives that have no Chinese equivalent. An engagement between Hellenist and sinological methods allows us to reconsider ultimately Greek categories and taxonomies that have dominated the comparative study of religion, especially divination, Lloyd 1996. For example, the distinction between inspired and technical divination is a legacy of Plato and Cicero that simply does not fit the Chinese mantic picture, Raffles 2013. Cosmogony and cosmology. Chinese systematic thought about cosmology may date to as early as the 9th century BCE, and gives rise to several fundamentally important concepts. First is the idea of a universe characterized by interactions of time and space, Yuju image, especially the correlation of areas of the world to the seasons of the year and periods of time such as the sexagenary cycle, Ganji image, the combinations of 10 heaven stems and 12 earth branches. This cosmos is ultimately composed of chi image, the energy that constitutes and organizes matter and causes growth and change, in processes of constant change, based on the interactions of yin and yang image and the 5 agents, waxing image, and interactions between heaven, earth, and humanity. Chinese cosmologies thus depict a universe that is interdependent and sometimes described as organic, Needham 1956, compared to Hall and Ames 1998, and characterized by the ongoing transformation of yin and yang, Graham 1986, Raffles 1998. Notions of cosmic unity also underline cleromantic techniques such as divination, prognostication by means of the Yi Jing or its predecessor, the Juyi image, Ju changes, in which the random manipulation of milfoil, yarrow, stalks revealed the underlying patterns of yin and yang manifest at the time and place of the procedure. A cosmology based on cyclic transformations has several important implications. One is a relative disinterest in cosmogony. While there are Chinese legends of the creation of the universe, cosmogony is less important than transformation and the view that the universe is in a constant process of mutual transformation of the yin and yang qi of which it is composed. A second is the notion of good and ill auspice, ji xiong image that certain times were propitious or inauspicious for certain activities. This idea was also central to Chinese mantic and ritual practice, discussed in mantic practices, and informed a large number of mantic techniques. Third, was the belief that sages could perceive pervasive connections and systematic correspondences between aspects of a cosmos in constant change. A cosmology based on transformation contrasts completely with the attempts of the ancient Greek pre-Socratic philosophers to identify stable ultimate constituents of matter, since yin, yang and waxing are phases, rather than elements. It also introduces a striking alternative to the Greek idea that human-divine interaction is the best or only way to understand the cosmos and the human place in it. Nonetheless, the Chinese attempt to understand the world as a constant transformation of yin and yang is also entirely commensurable with belief in the gods and spirits of its traditional religion. Given these differences, it is striking that macrocosm-microcosm analogies appear in both Chinese and Greek sources, but their significance is very different. In Chinese accounts, parallels between terrestrial and cosmic events and phenomena seem to have arisen precisely because they were considered to be interconnected, and events at one level were understood to produce effects at the other. Astronomical anomalies such as eclipses and comets were of particular interest, because they signified disruption in the heavens corresponding to disruptions in the human world, usually understood to be misrule by the reigning dynasty. By contrast, Greek astronomy and cosmology did not focus on anomalies in this way. Lloyd and Siving 2002, 214-15. Greek accounts present very different relations between the human microcosm and the cosmic macrocosm. The components for a macrocosm-microcosm theory, distinct from an explicit articulation of such a theory, have been attributed to early Greek thinkers, including Heraclitus, Democritus, the Pythagoreans, Empedocles, and the authors of the Hippocratic Corpus, Conger 1922, 2-7. The one extant clear Greek articulation of a macrocosm-microcosm analogy recognizes some kind of similar structure or process in the cosmos and in humanity. The fragment is ascribed to Anaximenes by Aetius: just as our soul which is air holds us together, so it is breath and air that encompasses the whole world. Deals, Crans 1903, 13b2, trans. Conger 1922, 2, compared to Allers 1944, 321-37, Lloyd 1966, 235-6. Plato also uses, but does not articulate, microcosmic theories, primarily analogies between structure, functions or health of the body or soul, and the state, Resp. 434-5, 441, 580 and between the created visible universe and its original, t. 30c, 35a, 36d, e, 39e, 40b. Aristotle describes the relation between the macros cosmos and micros cosmos as one of opposition, ph. 252b26. But none of these theories are interactive in the sense that Chinese cosmologies are. Greek microcosmic theories focus on technology, especially the complex interrelations between cosmological and biological theories. Finally, Greek theories reflect an anthropomorphic religion and an anthropocentric cosmos, Lloyd 1966. 194-9, 295-9, that has little or no Chinese counterpart. Gods and humans. Vernant argued that the ancient Greeks defined the human condition within a triad of animals, humans, and gods, 1980, compared to Detienne 1977, 1972, Detienne and Vernant 1989, 1979, Lloyd 2011. Vernant's study is part of an ongoing engagement between classics, anthropology, and structuralism, and he rejects three interdependent assumptions. 1. That every mythical figure is an independent entity with its own essence. 2. That this essence corresponds to some reality in the natural world. And 3. That the relation between myth and reality is symbolic in nature. Instead, Vernant argues that every god is defined by a network of relations of affinity and opposition to other gods within the Pantheon, 1980, 145. One function of polis religion and sacrifice in particular was to maintain the boundary between humans and gods. The use of animal victims ritually maintained the distinction between humans and animals. Detienne 1977, 1972. While many Chinese legends and literary motifs also feature interdependent relations between humans, animals, and gods, it is difficult to compare mythological systems because myth itself is a vexed category in Chinese thought and religion. Girardeau 1976, Juara 1988. What can be compared are debates of various kinds about the boundary between humans, animals, and gods, and the possibility that humans can practice some form of self-divinization and become like gods. A different context of triadic relations between humans, animals, and gods is comparable. Several Greek and Chinese philosophical texts created scales of nature that located humans within an evolutionary scale of animate beings. For example, the philosopher Zunzi, c.312-230 BCE, describes a progression of living things based on ascending faculties. According to Zunzi, water and fire have chi but no capacity for procreation. Grass and trees procreate but lack awareness. Birds and beasts have awareness but no capacity for moral judgment, yi image. Humans have chi, procreation, awareness, and also the capacity to behave correctly. Therefore, they are the highest form of life. Zunzi 9, 164. Aristotle, Duran. For 14b1 29b1, provides an interesting contrast in his account of the faculties of the soul, nutrition and reproduction, threpticon, sensation, aestheticon, desire, ereticon, locomotion, kineton katatopon, imagination, fantasia, and reason, nous, to dianoeticon. Again, the higher the being, the more numerous and more nuanced its faculties. Almost all living things nourish themselves and reproduce, all animals share sensation, desire, and locomotion. Some animals have imagination and limited reason, but only humans possess imagination and reason. Aristotle, Metaph. 1.1, 980b1, 981a3, grants animals intelligence, phronesis, but qualifies this by differentiating animal from human phronesis, FNIC 1141a22, 8. Elsewhere he denies animals reason, thought, and intellect, Duran. For 04b4, 6, for 14b18, 19, for 28 and 19, 24, compared to Sarabi 1995, 12-16. Finally, Aristotle privileges reason, and places humans between animals and gods, FNIC 1177b25, 32. And states that a man without a polis is either bad or above all humans, Paul 12:52-1. Both Zunzi and Aristotle thus portray animals and humans on evolutionary scales, but of very different kinds. Zunzi's scale ends with human morality, with no reference to divine powers. Aristotle considers contemplation, theoria, akin to the activity of the gods, while other virtues are purely human, Paul 1178-8-10. Both passages are interesting for what they do not say. Many Chinese gods were people who excelled in virtue or who became revered ancestors. Recent sinological scholarship has turned attention towards a 4th century self-cultivation literature, often associated with the 16th chapter of the Guanzi, Neie image, 16:1-6b, trans. Rickett 1998. 39-55. This literature described the use of self-cultivation through qi to gain power over things in the world. Thus, according to some claims from this period, the human-divine boundary is also permeable insofar as humans could attain divine powers through self-cultivation techniques. Michael Puett argues that the term Shen image, spirit, has two distinct referents. It refers to spirits who reside in the extrahuman world and hold power over natural phenomena, but it also refers to refined forms of qi within the human body, 2002, 21-2. Either way, the boundary between the human and the divine is permeable. By contrast, the Greek boundary between mortals and immortals is absolute and defined by mortality. Gods lived forever and could know the future. For example, Julia Kint, 2003, has argued that Delphic oracle stories are an important part of a Greek reflective discourse on the world and the place of humans within it. Differing attitudes towards the nature of divinity also may have contributed to very different attitudes towards the boundary between what was considered natural and supernatural. The relative harmony between the human and divine realms in much, though not all, Chinese religious thought contrasts with Greek accounts of tension between humans and gods, in which the human and divine are incommensurable categories. Both Chinese and Greek metaphysics assumed the existence of gods or divine powers and the possibility of communicating with them, with important implications for the mantic arts. Within both traditions there is disagreement over whether divine powers had a benign interest in human affairs. In both traditions there are examples of economies of human-divine relations based on prayer and sacrifice. Greek bird and weather divination and Chinese oracle bone divination offered ways for diviners to effectively negotiate with the gods by means of repeated questions, as, for example, at Dodona, Idunel 2013, 2007. Both traditions also include ethical frameworks for divination, based on presumed correlations between cosmic and human orders. Both Chinese and Greek philosophers emphasized the ethical role of divination as part of the divine concepts of justice and retribution. But Greek and Chinese understandings of the nature of these interactions were very different, and there was a long history of debate within each tradition. Chinese models of divine, human relations were genetic, gods as royal ancestors, or bureaucratic, gods as a hierarchy of rulers and officials. Some Chinese mantic techniques addressed particular gods responsible for specific time periods and modes of activity, but they progressively de-emphasized direct communication or negotiation with divine powers. Greek assumptions about the benevolence and interest of the gods in humanity are equivocal. Bird and weather diviners associated a wide range of phenomena with communications from particular gods and predictions of particular kinds, and omens were understood to systematically reflect divine intentions. These practices persisted into Hellenistic Greece, but the legacy of Plato and Cicero privileged oracular divination. The gods of Greek myth were notoriously fickle. The arbitrariness of human fates and the indifference of the gods are recurring themes. Hellenistic philosophers shifted to the idea that the future was somehow predetermined and thence predictable, but this shift corresponded with cults of and ideas about touch. Bobzian 1998, Hankinson 1998, Idinel 2011. One result was a systematic and abstract reflection on problems of cause, necessity, and the logical preconditions that made divination possible and legitimate. Starting in the late Warring States period, competing schemata began to link yin and yang, variously described, to phenomena in space, the directions, time, the calendar, notions of good and ill auspice, and the body. The eventual hermeneutics of Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, correlative cosmology focused on elaborate microcosm correspondences between the three realms of heaven, earth, and humanity, and used numbers to express these symbolic correlations. Chinese correlative cosmology also provided natural explanations for the establishment and expansion of the Han Dynasty, while scholar officials used correlative cosmology and discourses on omens to define and circumscribe royal power through admonition. This contrast between Chinese and Greek attitudes towards the gods and divinity also informs a defining issue in 20th-century discussions of Chinese thought, namely, the cultural uniqueness of Chinese cosmology or its commensurability with Western cosmologies. On one side of the debate, Weber, 1951, argued that the Chinese were limited by the lack of a notion of transcendence or tension between the human and divine realms. On the other, Marcel Granit, 1980, 1934, argued for the distinctiveness of Chinese cosmology because of the lack of demarcation of human and divine realms, including a notion of transcendence. Granit's work informed a wide range of subsequent studies, especially the work of Joseph Needham, with Wang, 1956, K. C. Chang, 1986, A. C. Graham, 1986, 1991, David Hall and Roger Ames, 1995, and Michael Puett, 2002. These all argue that radically different cosmologies distinguish China and the West. Mantic practices. The early history of Chinese mantic practice presents important contrasts to Greek modes of divination. See further, in this volume, Flower, Chapter 20, and Ilse Johnston, Chapter 32, and also to comparative studies of Greek and African divination. Vernant's key insight, the need to study divination through the dual aspects of intellectual and social operations, arose specifically through the comparative study of African divination. Yet the impetus for the comparison arose entirely from the study of Greek religion, especially the Delphic oracle, and the comparison privileged issues central to Greek religion. A second problem was that the Greek-African comparison did not use comparable contexts because comparisons of Apolline divination at Delphi and various forms of African divination juxtaposed official or state and private queries. Social and institutional comparables. We can identify 5 comparable social and institutional contexts of Chinese and Greek mantic practices, Raffles 2013, which informs this entire section. The first is a contrast between official and independent practitioners, although it must be emphasized that Greek and Chinese official and independent mantic specialists practiced under very different conditions. The Greek distinction was between oracles and the independent, self-employed, and sometimes itinerant mantes. There is a corresponding Chinese distinction between court ritualists, who determined auspicious days and prognosticated on other official matters, and independent marketplace fortune-tellers and fate calculation experts, Swan Ming's Yansheng image. In both contexts, we know less about the independent practitioners, since few records of such consultations survived. Both Greek and Chinese independent practitioners seem to have enjoyed lower status than their official counterparts. Within a Greek context, a possible explanation is that their procedures were perceived as less objective and more subject to manipulation. Here, a Chinese perspective parochializes the Greek evidence because many independent Chinese mantic specialists used the same methods as their official counterparts, turtle and milfoil, diviners' boards, and hemorrhology, Shiji 127, Low 1994. A second comparable is the importance of mantic lineages, albeit for different reasons. Greek mantes derived competitive advantage from claims of descent from a mantic family, and some oracles were managed by priestly clans. With no institutional procedures for selecting and training mantic specialists, lineage claims provided some assurance of competence, as well as a context for instruction and the transmission of texts. In some Chinese cases, family transmission included daughters as well as sons, Hu Shu 82b, 2717. A third comparable is competition between mantic expertise and other kinds of technical, textual, or ritual mastery. The relative independence of mantic experts and the absence of central political power in both warring states China, 450 to 221 BCE, and 5th and early 4th century Greece led to intense intellectual and political competition between intellectual specialists. The extent of state control of mantic activity in early China is a matter of debate, and no such control existed in archaic Greece. In warring states China, social and geographic mobility probably helped diffuse mantic activity from the courts of kings. Mantic experts competed for employment by local courts and wealthy families. Nonetheless, the official character of divination persisted through its links to state ritual. Mantic practices performed in local courts or families drew their authority from connection to state ritual. A striking result of this competition in the Chinese case is the pervasive absence of mantic texts from the received textual tradition. Many titles survive in the technical sections of the bibliographic treatise of the Standard History of the Han, Hanshu 30, but only the Yi Jing has survived in the received tradition, Raffles 2008 to 2009. By contrast, mantic texts are widespread among texts excavated from tombs. Greek mantic activity was competitive at several levels. Independent mantes needed quick wits, flexibility, and a great deal of personal charisma, possibly a result of a cultural translation of Mesopotamian mantic practices to Greece, Flower 2008. In China, by contrast, the two types of practitioner coexisted, interacted, and often used the same methods. There was also a polarization between the status and activities of male and female Greek diviners that has no equivalent in China. Female mantes were of lower status than their male counterparts for several reasons. Priestesses worked under the management of the male priestly lineages, and female independent mantes lacked access to the key roles of military advisor and ritualist. For further details, see Flower 2008 and Raffles 2013. A fourth comparable is the dynamics of mantic consultation, both question topics and the dynamics of interaction between consulter and practitioner. Initially, Chinese and Greek question topics seem strikingly similar. States sought mantic advice on warfare, alliances, rainfall and harvests, disasters, choice of personnel, major plans and policies, and on ritual, sacrifice, and other matters of state religious cult. Private consulters asked about domestic matters, especially marriage, children, prosperity, and illness, and about intended actions, including travel, changes of residence, and decisions about livelihood or financial decisions. Importantly, most questions are not predictive. They ask what will be advantageous, pleasing to the gods, or auspicious. Such questions do not invite factual and direct verification. But there are important differences. Chinese questions and methods attempt to map good and ill auspices onto chronological cycles. The result is a model of the operation of good auspice that is not immediately dependent on divine goodwill. The focus of risk and doubt becomes temporal, and questions of this kind ask not what to do but when to do it. Both Chinese and Greek materials indicate the psychological interactions between client and practitioner, and the possibility of negotiation when the results are undesirable. Contemporary fieldwork shows Chinese temple diviners and itinerant practitioners finding ways to mitigate truly disastrous results without undermining their own authority. Xenophon's and 7.8.36 account of his meeting with the mantis Euclides also attests to the importance of a skilled mantis knowing his client. Accounts of both Chinese temple diviners and Greek independent mantis stress their combination of astute observation and self-confidence. We see these skills equally clearly in the hostile accounts of reformed fortune-tellers from the People's Republic of China revealing the tricks of their trade. In this, they differ from official practitioners, whose choice of method was at least partially determined by their office. By contrast, a choice of methods is good for business. The consulters we know least about are women and slaves, who frequently appear as topics in questions posed by men, but rarely speak in their own voices. There is evidence that women and slaves consulted oracles of Zeus at Dodona and Asclepios at Epidaurus, and flight and manumission may be topics of consultation at Dodona. Idinal 2012, 2013, 2007, 102-5, iHote 2006, numbers 60-4. Chinese evidence shows women using mantic expertise, especially in physiognomy. This expertise would have become increasingly invisible with the institutionalization of mantic practices in the Western Han. A fifth comparable is the ways in which mantic consultation reflects perceptions of risk. Consultation by individuals tells us something about the personal concerns and perceived dangers of ordinary people. Idinal 2013, 2007, 3-5. Here, the archaeological and textual records offer fewer opportunities. Because of the very different institutions and methods of mantic consultation, it is very difficult to find comparable Greek and Chinese sources. The Shuahudi Daybooks, Pu 1998, and Dodona Lead Tablets, Proc 1967, Idinal 2013, 2007, both present explicit categories of mantic query, and, juxtaposed, give us a comparative window on the perception of risk in everyday life. We also find perceptions of risk in the questions posed by official consulters, especially on the subject of warfare. Both Hellenistic Greek and late Warring States Chinese warfare were transformed by the emergence of large armies and new technologies, yet criticisms of military divination underscore that it was still performed. Astronomy and astrology were a very different case. Astronomy became politically charged, especially during the Eastern Han, Eberhard 1957, and the Roman Empire, Barton 1994, because of the potential of omens and anomalies to affirm or question the legitimacy and future of the ruling house. Physiognomy also had ideological and rhetorical uses, but it did not become an object of the same kind of imperial patronage or debate. Official interest and patronage also coexisted with the expanding use of personal or private divination. This situation provided both advantages and disadvantages for diviners and their consulters. Intellectual comparables. Divination also left its mark on a wide range of Chinese and Greek intellectual domains, Vernant 1974, Kemmler, Harper, and Kolinowski 1999. I focus on two comparables. First, both Chinese and Greek metaphysical assumptions led to beliefs in semiosis and hermeneutics, that mantic signs manifested hidden patterns, and could be read and interpreted by those with the correct expertise. Manetti 1993, Struck 2004. But these beliefs, and debates about them, resulted from different assumptions, led in different directions, and changed over time. Greek divination was linked to speculation about cosmology and to the development of theories of hermeneutics and semiosis, Struck 2004. In China, the problem of criteria for validating and rejecting interpretations was closely linked to the use of writing, Bagley 2004. Second, these practices affected the growth of systematic thought and abstraction. They led to a perceived need for techniques for validating or rejecting signs and interpretations. The ambiguity that was so central to Greek reflective narratives about divination is virtually absent in China, where theorizing cosmic regularity was a key goal of mantic activity. The Chinese and Greek mantic arts are also important philosophy and science. A comparative perspective reveals a different picture: areas in which divination was linked to the observation of regularities in nature, the development of techniques for observation and verification, and to analyses of cause and effect. Finally, mantic expertise produced the systematic expression of abstract concepts in formal systems such as the hexagrams of the I Ching. Even if we no longer use systems such as Stoic mantic hermeneutics, Bobsian 1998, Hankinson 1998, the importance of the ability to articulate such systems cannot be overstated. The oldest Chinese written records are divination questions inscribed on animal scapulae and turtle shells, the so-called oracle bone inscriptions, Jurguwin image, Cately 1978, 1988, Bagley 2004, although there is also significant evidence that the oral aspects of mantic ritual were important, Jamori 1999. Chinese mantic practitioners developed strongly visual symbolic practices that have no counterpart in Greek divination, including milfoil divination, techniques for observing qi, including the vapors of clouds and mists, and physiognomy. Finally, there was no Greek equivalent to Chinese ritual classics, such as the Li Ji, Record of Rites, and Ju Li, Rites of Ju, which provided the theoretical and practical foundations for ritual practice, including divination. Nor did the Greeks ever connect divination, ritual, writing, and record-keeping in the tight relation that was fundamental to Chinese mantic practices and intellectual development. This picture contrasts with a Greek preference for spoken divination, Vernant 1974, Thomas 1992. Both Greek and African practices were predominantly oral and performative, Peake 1991. But as written literature increasingly replaced traditional Greek modes of oral expression, new political, scientific, and philosophical systems of thought assimilated and partially displaced divination in a new discourse of rationality. Oracles introduced complex sequences of consultation, response, and transmission of an original response to a distant consulta state, Fontenrose 1976, Maurizio 1997. The oral orientation of early Greek divination did not encourage the development of systematic or symbolic systems for decoding and interpreting omens. By contrast, from an early period Chinese divination was based on a system of written signs, the hexagrams of the I Ching. Mantic practices based on writing offered a prospect of decoding the text of the universe itself. Thus, Greek divination was culturally conservative in important ways that have no Chinese counterpart. Although traditional Chinese emphasis on ritual has often been described as culturally conservative or counterproductive to progress, the history of divination suggests a very different possibility. Why were mantic and ritual texts compiled in China but not in Greece? Divination by shells, bones, and milfoil predate Chinese mantic texts by hundreds or thousands of years. Michael Lowe, 1994, has speculated that stylized ritual procedures displaced the spontaneous actions and reactions of earlier mantic experts, and that even the original motives for mantic procedures may have been lost by the time ritual and texts were written down. Similar questions concern possible reasons for the creation of the omen collections that, over a long and complex history, became the I Ching. Greek and Chinese divination methods also diverge in relation to naturalistic thinking. Here, the key difference is the perceived involvement of divine powers. Chinese mantic methods and attitudes were compatible with naturalistic inquiry and offered opportunities for it. By contrast, a tension between naturalism and divination closely tied to the gods seems peculiarly Greek. Although Greek naturalistic medicine coexisted with iatromancy, explicit Greek medical notions of nature and cause have no Chinese counterpart. Here again, comparison underscores the danger of broad historical generalization from limited and culturally specific Greek evidence. An enduring intellectual legacy of the Western Han was the selective canonization and official sponsorship of some texts and marginalization of others. Technical arts, including the mantic arts, were largely excluded from official ideology and institutions. The Yi Jing continued to enjoy a privileged position as a work of moral knowledge, not as a mantic text. These developments were intellectually conservative, and, overall, constrained the kind of systematic and abstract thought often linked to the development of science and philosophy. Here astrocalendrics are an exception. Both standard histories and excavated texts show the increasing complexity of astronomical observation and theory. By contrast, Greek interest in astronomy, astrology, and calendrics did not take the form of state sponsorship. Lloyd and Siving 2002. In summary, Chinese and Greek mantic practices contributed to systematic thought in very different ways. Chinese notions of symmetry, number, and abstract patterns of change were central to the development of systematic medicine, astronomy, and cosmology. Greek debates about divination were central to the development of skepticism, logic, and theories of causation. Conclusion. The Chinese evidence challenges received opinion in classical scholarship on religion, cosmology, and divination in several ways. It is immediately striking that many Chinese mantic techniques simply do not fit into conventional frameworks of inspired and technical or intuitive and inductive divination. Bouchlekler 1975, 1879–1882. Greek divination addresses the will of the gods, mediated through natural phenomena and a communication system of signs. Most Chinese methods keep a respectful distance from divine powers, and are abstract, systematic, and significantly based on number and calculation. Most Greek procedures presupposed a direct divine origin for divinatory signs that privileged spontaneous events, especially the movements of birds, thunder and lightning, involuntary motion, and dreams. Given these fundamental differences, it is no surprise that apparently similar techniques were understood very differently. Wind divination, physiognomy, and claromancy are cases in point. The origins of oracular divination and the Delphic oracle have vexed Greek scholarship on divination for decades. Fontenrose 1978, Price 1985, Mauricio 1995, 1997, and here the Chinese evidence has a particular contribution to make. Comparative evidence has been used to claim that, in other societies, oracles also provided ways to address social change, attain consensus, and diffuse blame. The Chinese evidence contributes to a transcultural understanding of the origins of oracles, their roles in periods of social and political upheaval, and the nature of religious and mantic authority. For example, Greek oracular divination, especially at Delphi, drew authority from its independence from the state. By contrast, Chinese mantic activity drew its authority from connection with rulership. Comparison also shows that mantic queries provided a wide range of responses, including predictions, which were verifiable, normative advice, and a means for political consensus and authority. The Chinese evidence thus invites reconsideration of the sociological argument that divination was less concerned with prediction than with social regulation and consensus. Pock 1967, Parker 2000, 1985, Morgan 1989, 1990, Bowden 2005. The Chinese evidence makes it clear that we cannot reduce the social function of divination to consensus and regulation. It presents clear interest in both prediction and verification as early as the oracle bone inscriptions. In conclusion, we can identify two coexisting tendencies in Chinese and Greek religion and divination. One was towards empirical procedures that relied on observation, was refined by experience, and whose pragmatic value was predictive. The other was towards a symbolic mode of discourse that provided normative advice or social consensus, whose procedures were religious and ritual, which understood phenomena as correspondences between macrocosm and microcosm, and whose pragmatic value was rhetorical, social, and political. Suggested reading. For Chinese cosmology, religion, and mantic practices, see especially Ngo van Zuyet 2002, 1976, Graham 1991, Lowe 1994, Pu 1998, Kemmler, Harper, and Kolinowski 1999, and Puet 2002. For Greek cosmology, religion, and divination, see especially Vernant 1974 and 1980, 1972, Price 1985, Parker 2000, 1985, Bowden 2005, Flower 2008, and Idinel 2011 and 2013, 2007. For comparative perspective see Raffles 1992 and 2013, DeChien 2000, Lloyd 2002, Lloyd and Siving 2002, Yu 2007, and King 2013. Considerations of gender in mantic practice are discussed in Maurizio 1995, Raffles 1998 and 2013, Idinel 2012 and 2013, 2007, and Flower 2008. This chapter does not attempt to cite all modern work on Greek divination. For a further selection on this topic, see, in this volume, chapters 20 and 32.